oftentimes when you see African scientists lauded for their achievements, it's, oh, great African scientist, not great scientist who happens to be African. And I think there's a really important distinction there. There's always this step down. And like, oh, you're good, but you're good by African standards. And I reject that.
Hello, healthcare enthusiasts, and welcome back to The Cure. This is the podcast where we're revolutionizing the business of healthcare in Africa, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Temitope Coker, and in each episode, I sit down with the people that are shaping the future of healthcare in Africa, from founders to investors to policymakers and researchers and beyond. And our goal is to infuse hope back into the narrative by spotlighting the momentum and the progress that is already unfolding across the continent. At the heart of every episode is a question. What does it take to revolutionize the African healthcare business model? All of our insights are powered by TC Health, your trusted source for healthcare and pharmaceutical insights in sub-Saharan Africa. So let's get into today's episode. Today, we're going to be talking about DNA. Your DNA, as you know, is unique to you, but it also connects you to a much bigger story. And Africa has the most diverse genomes in the world. Yet less than 2% of the data used to design new medicines, new treatments, comes from African people. That means many of the drugs on our shelves that you take for common conditions were never really tested with us fully in mind or fully at the forefront. And so today we're asking a question. What if the future of cancer care, of precision medicine, could be shaped by African data for African patients? And our guest, Dr. Yaw Bediako, is working to make that future real. Dr. Yaw is an immunologist and entrepreneur, reshaping how the world thinks about African genomics. Yaw trained at Northwestern University in Chicago and then went on to do postdoctoral research in the Kenya Medical Research Institute, the Francis Crick Institute in London, and the University of Ghana's West African Center for Cell Biology of Infectious Pathogens. In 2020, he co-founded Yemaachi Biotech in Accra, Ghana, with the mission of using Africa's genomic diversity to transform cancer care research and treatment. And under his leadership, Yemaachi has launched groundbreaking initiatives like TACA, the African Cancer Atlas, a project to sequence and catalog data from thousands of African patients, creating the world's most diverse cancer database. He's also built collaborative networks like African, connecting researchers and clinicians across African countries. So Yaw is not only pushing the science forward, he's also raising some of the most important questions of our time about genomic sovereignty, equity, and Africa's role in the future of precision medicine. Yaw, welcome to The Cure.
Thank you. We're happy to be here.
Now, before we jump into our conversation today, I wanted to take a few minutes to appropriately set the stage and outline some of the signals we've been seeing in the landscape of genomics and cancer care in Africa. I have to admit, when I was doing the research for this episode, I kind of geeked out. I went down several rabbit holes, and you are the experts. I mean, you have a PhD in these things, so feel free to jump in and add some of that scientific layering to what I'm saying. But sure. I went on a whole deep dive on looking into Africa's genetic diversity, because you hear it everywhere. Africa has the most diverse genome in the world. But I wanted to actually understand, what does that actually look like? What does that mean and why? And so if you would all permit me to go through my long spiel, I promise it's very interesting and very enlightening. So I'll start with some stats on African genetic diversity. Africa's population's high genetic diversity presents so many opportunities for personalized and precision medicine, including improving pharmacogenomics, which we actually talked about in our previous episode with Charles, understanding gene interactions, discovering new variants, mapping disease genes, and creating these kind of updated genomic reference panels and validating biomarkers. Now, this is just a fancy schmancy way of saying that because Africa has such a diverse set of genomes, it holds enormous opportunities to transform precision medicine. So medicine that's tailored to your specific genetic code. And so it can help us understand how genomic diseases develop, discover new targets, identify actionable ways to target specific treatments, including certain cancers. And so I'm going to just present a few stats around this to paint that picture of the scale of the diversity. And so the first stat is that the average African genome has nearly 1 million more genetic variants than the average non-African genome. Africa is also immensely culturally and ethno-linguistically diverse. I knew Africa was diverse. Every country has multiple ethnic groups, but I didn't understand or appreciate the scale. So while the rest of the world averages between 3 and 5-ish ethnic groups per country, African countries have an average of greater than 8 ethnic groups.
And
per
Nigeria,
country.
of course, has
like 100.
Exactly.
And account in total for 43% of the world's ethnic groups. So almost half of the world's ethnic groups are in Africa, which I found really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, that even evolutionarily makes sense if we think of the human species evolving from Africa and Africa being the original almost melting pot.
Yes.
And then a few individuals migrated out. And so they would take their culture with them, they would take their genes with them, but they would be a subset.
Yeah.
So even linguistically, you take the languages you speak, you don't take the languages that your neighbors speak.
Yeah.
And so, I think it makes sense that you would see such a high diversity on the African continent, and everywhere else we see more homogeneous because they represent founder populations that originated from Africa and then established new settlements in other parts of the world.
See, this is why it's good to have somebody that has a PhD in these things, because I went down an hours long rabbit hole.
Hopefully it was a good rabbit hole.
It was a great
You found
rabbit
a rabbit
hole.
at the
I
end.
found the rabbits.
Exactly.
I found several rabbits. And what you were just referring to, I saw it in a research paper referred to as the bottleneck theory, which we'll get to in a moment, because that is like the why of why Africa is so much more diverse than everywhere else. But another statistic is that Africa, and this one I have to really go to like secondary school biology. So hope everybody is paying attention. But African populations have the highest levels of nucleotide and haplotype diversity in both nuclear and mitochondrial genomes. I'm looking to you to just sense check compared to non-Africans. So if we break that down, and if you took biology in secondary school, you may or may not remember that the building blocks of our DNA are nucleotides. And there are 4 building blocks called adenine, A, thymine, T, guanine, G, and cytosine, C. And the nucleotides attach to each other, so A with T, G with C, to form chemical bonds called base pairs. And these connect the 2 DNA strands to form that well-known helix structure of DNA that we have. Now, when we say African populations have the highest nucleotide diversity, it means there are more differences in those A, T, and GC pairings across individuals. So more variety in the fundamental code of life, which carries very important clues about our evolution, our health, etc. And then a haplotype, so that was nucleotide. A haplotype is a set of DNA variations or polymorphisms that tend to be inherited together as a block. So in other words, instead of looking at a single AT and GC pairing, we're looking at a whole stretch of DNA that often passes from parent to child intact. And so when we think about haplotype diversity, we mean the variety of those inherited blocks across individuals and populations. And so Africans have diversity in both nucleotide and haplotype genetics. And this tells us not only that there are more single letter differences in DNA, but the larger patterns that you see in which those differences are arranged are also more diverse in Africa. So the sheer scale of diversity, when you actually dig into it, it's actually quite mind-blowing just how large it is.
Yeah. And I mean, one thing I would add, since you've gone deep into
We've
genetics,
gone into secondary school biology.
Is from a pharmaceutical perspective, the diversity is also potentially very powerful. So the haplotype you described, there's something called linkage disequilibrium, which is the likelihood that you would transfer a set of genes from one person down your lineage. Now, when we try to do association studies where we try to find the relationship between a genetic variant and a phenotype, or phenotype just means the manifestation of your genes, which could be disease susceptibility or other things. African genomes, because they have larger linkage disequilibrium blocks, it's easier to associate. It's easier to associate a genetic variant with a phenotype. So even from a fundamental genetic research level, African genomes are easier to make associations. So it's easier to say, oh, this gene is associated with this disease because the blocks are such that there's been less. It's less. There are fewer genes to confound it. So when you look at European genomes, you're not always clear which gene is responsible for the trait. When you look at African genomes, because of how the genes are structured in those populations, and this is going back evolutionarily, it's easier to make those. So from a pharma research perspective, doing these association studies in African populations is easier than in other populations because you can make conclusions much quicker.
Yeah.
We can draw conclusions.
Interesting. So it's not just that the sheer scale of the genomic code that you're able to research, it's also like the simplicity in drawing conclusions or drawing connections from that.
Yeah, you can think of Africans as representing ancestral lineages of the human species. So you're almost going back to the original record.
Yeah.
Over time, our genes evolve and change and differences happen. And so you accumulate differences. When you go to some of these ancestral lineages on the African continent, it's almost, it's more straightforward.
Yeah.
So it's like going to the, original copy without all the changes that have happened over, 50,000 or 200,000 years. It's going back to that original copy and then being able to say, oh, this variant associated with this.
Yeah.
And so then that is applicable across all people. You can then take that information and now look at Europeans or Asians and make sense of some of the changes that you see in those populations because you've understood it from the original copy, which is the African copy. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of African data.
Yeah.
So, that's what we're trying to solve.
That's what you're trying to solve, which we'll talk about. But I think the idea of the original copy is really interesting because at this point, you're probably, if you're listening or watching, you're probably wondering why the African genome is so diverse. And as I was doing all this research, I was wondering the exact same thing. So, like I said, I geeked out a bit and went down rabbit holes. And coming back to this bottleneck effect. So essentially, when small groups of humans migrated out of Africa, 50, 70,000 years ago, they carried with them only a fraction of the genetic diversity on the continent. And so the group that left Africa is estimated, like some people have done some research, to have included 600 effective founding females, which is quite a small, I mean, probably in those times, when there were animals trying to eat you here and there. But that's quite a small group of effective founding females outside of the continent. So that means that from the perspective of genetic diversity, only about 600 female lineages estimated contributed to the non-African gene pool at that bottleneck. So that bottleneck effect is quite stuck in terms of why we then see modern Europeans, Asians, and others outside Africa have fewer variants overall. And Africa, by contrast, kept the full library, the full original copy. And so when you compare two Africans, they're often more genetically different from one another than an African and someone outside the continent, which I find really interesting. And I also, again, several rabbit holes, like I said. There's also all sorts of interesting aspects that have shaped our DNA due to natural selection and local adaptation. And one of the most interesting ones, at least that I found, was some theories indicate the presence of malaria has shaped our DNA, where variants like the sickle cell trait arose in African populations because they gave certain people a survival advantage against malaria. So I'm not sure if people know this, but if you have some sickled red blood cells or if you have the sickle cell trait, you are somewhat protected from malaria. So you have that survival advantage against malaria. Obviously, this mutation can make you very sick, but it actually, like evolutionary, it's kind of protective against one of the most prominent and widespread diseases, at least on the continent.
Yeah, so I mean, people know about sickle trait versus sickle disease. So those who are homozygous, they have 2 copies of the sickle gene, are those who have sickle cell disease. And they are the ones who suffer the severe crises and usually have, a shorter lifespan than those who don't. But those who are carriers are otherwise healthy, but they basically have some of their cells, their blood cells expressing the sickle trait. Because they are heterozygous, they have 1 normal copy of the gene and 1 sickle copy. They don't have any disease symptoms.
Yeah.
But it appears that sort of mixture makes them more resistant to malaria, because malaria parasites live in your red blood cells, and sickle affects the shape and the membrane dynamics of your red blood cells. So basically, sickle makes the red blood cells less hospitable to the parasite. So, but because you are just a carrier, you have a bunch of cells that are fine, and you have a bunch of cells that have the sickle trait. You have enough good red blood cells that you don't have any disease symptoms of sickle.
Yeah.
But having that mixture appears to make you a bit more resistant to malaria.
Yeah.
So you select. So in malaria endemic areas where malaria is responsible for a lot of childhood mortality, you end up having this natural selection where people with the sickle trait are selected for because they are more fit, meaning they are more able to survive. And so that perpetuates the sickle cell disease, because people who are carriers can have children who have sickle cell disease if 2 carriers have a child together. So that is an example. And actually, the unique thing about sickle is it's really across the parts of the world that have malaria.
Yeah.
So you find it in parts of Europe where historically they had malaria, more Mediterranean areas. So sickle is not a black person's disease.
Yeah.
It's actually a disease that has been selected for in areas that had high levels of malaria. So you see it in the Mediterranean, you see it in, in Africa, but even in Africa, it's in West Africa and Equatorial Africa. You don't see as much sickle in other parts, Southern or North Africa, where malaria is not as prevalent.
Interesting. Yeah, see, I think the rabbit hole was worth it. You learn all of these things about just how even things like lactase persistence, like with pastoralist groups, like all sorts of just traits that have been shaped by our DNA or have shaped our DNA. And that's just a very, very long-winded way to say that Africa is incredibly genetically diverse. And that's like the foundation of the conversation that we're going to have today.
Indeed.
So yeah, that was a very long-winded way of saying Africa is incredibly genetically diverse. And so that got me thinking, if we are so diverse, what's actually being done on the continent to harness this diversity? And there are actually several initiatives underway on the continent to tap into this genetic diversity, obviously Yemaachi being one of them. But there is H3 Africa, the Human, Hereditary, and Health in Africa initiative, so that's the H3 Africa, was launched in 2010 by the National Institutes of Health in the US, the Wellcome Trust, and the African Society of Human Genetics. Its goal was to build genomics research capacity across Africa, so funding biobanks, sequencing facilities, and bioinformatics hubs, also training hundreds of African scientists in this field. And over a decade, H3 Africa helped create some of the lasting infrastructure that we have for genomic science on the continent. It seeded a whole generation of African researchers who are now leading their own labs and leading their own programs. And so then building on that foundation, the 3 million African genomics, so 3MAG, is it 3MAG or 3MAG?
I don't know. I've seen it written. I've never heard it pronounced.
3MAG.
But I know the professor behind it.
The 3MAG project was proposed in 2019 as the next bold step. And the aim there was to sequence 3 million African genomes over 10 years, creating a reference data set large enough to capture the continent's full genetic diversity, as we've just discussed, which is very, very broad. The vision is that 3MAG will not only close that gap in the global representation of the African genome, but also accelerate discoveries that directly improve healthcare in Africa. But not just in Africa, the whole world, as we'll touch on in this discussion, as we touched on in our last discussion with Charles. When you make drugs safer, based on the African genome and for African patients. Due to that genetic diversity, you make drugs safer technically for the rest of the world. And so when we think about together all of these initiatives, 3MAG, H3 Africa, they represent this shift from Africa being studied on the outside to Africans building the data, building the infrastructure, and the expertise to kind of drive that genomic science from within. We also have things like the African Center of Excellence for Genomics of Infectious Disease in Nigeria. It's led by Dr. Christian Happy, and it's pioneering CRISPR-based diagnostics and sequencing for the purposes of African public health needs. And obviously, we're going to talk about Yemaachi contributing to the space today, but I think all of these initiatives tie perfectly into the theme of season 1, which is by Africa for Africa. We're making these genomic discoveries, these genomic research possible on the African continent by Africans who are studying it and for the benefit and purpose of serving African patients, which in turn benefits everybody else. So I found that really interesting. And then I know I said at the beginning that Yemaachi is focused on cancer. And so I wanted to also touch on the cancer burden in Africa because it's huge and likely underreported.
Yes.
So the numbers we're about to talk through are actually probably a lower end of what the real numbers actually look like. And so Africa has a significant cancer burden. In 2020, Africa as a whole, so this is Northern Africa plus Sub-Saharan Africa, recorded about 1.1 million new cancer cases and more than 700,000 deaths. And in Sub-Saharan Africa alone, recorded roughly about 850,000 new cancer cases and about 560,000 deaths in 2022. And so you can see that compared to the incidence, the mortality is actually disproportionately high. And that's because most patients present late, where you have limited access to advanced treatment, or when the disease has progressed far along that, some of the treatments won't be as effective. And when we look into the cancers that dominate the burden in Africa, they are breast cancer, cervical cancer, prostate cancer, liver cancer, and colorectal cancers. Obviously for women, breast cancer and cervical cancer are the leading threats, while for men, prostate and liver cancers are among some of the deadliest. And I wanted to let's take cervical cancer as an example. According to the WHO, in Africa, 34 out of every 100,000 women are diagnosed with cervical cancer, and 23 out of every 100,000 women die from cervical cancer every year. When you compare this figure with 7 out of every 100,000 women being diagnosed with cervical cancer in North America. So remember, Africa's diagnosis rate was 34 out of every 100,000. It's 7 out of every 100,000 in North America. And when we look at death rates, Africa is 23 out of every 100,000 women. North America is 3 out of every 100,000 women dying of the disease in North America. So in Africa, most of these women are diagnosed at an advanced stage of cancer, which is associated with poor outcomes. But there's always hope. Where the hope lies is that cervical cancer is largely preventable. So with HPV vaccination, that kind of chain of infection that leads to most cervical cancers can actually be broken. And as of 2023, about 29 African countries have incorporated HPV vaccination into their national immunization programs. So for example, Rwanda, being a pioneer on the continent, launched its national HPV program in 2011 and has achieved very high coverage rates, some actually above many higher income countries. And in Nigeria, for example, we rolled out our HPV vaccination campaign in October of 2023. Togo, for example, followed in November 2023. So you're seeing more and more of these African countries rolling out these national HPV campaigns that will hopefully reduce the incidence of cervical cancer across the continent. We also want to talk a bit more about precision medicine, because a lot of the work Yemaachi is doing is genomics in cancer with the end goal of improving the treatments that are available for African patients and patients across the globe. And so over the past 2 decades, obviously cancer care has been transformed by precision medicine everywhere. So molecular testing, targeted therapies, they have dramatically improved survival rates for some of the world's deadliest cancers. So even some of those big cancers we mentioned in Africa, breast cancer, cervical cancer, prostate cancer, treatments like monoclonal antibodies, treatments like immunotherapies have become standard of care in many places. Some of them replacing older regimens like chemo, which can have some toxicities and adverse events issues. And that turns cancers, certain cancers that used to be death sentences, to manageable conditions, to extending the survival rate of people diagnosed with certain cancers. But when we look at Africa, the story is more complicated. Precision medicine exists here, but it's mostly in different pockets. And one of the biggest issues is access is constrained by lab capacity. So being able to actually test and identify genetic biomarkers that can identify the treatments that would best serve a patient. Reimbursement, so who's going to pay for it? That's the biggest question. And the availability of trained staff to administer and treat these patients and to administer these therapies. And most patients still don't get your routine biomarker testing before treatment decisions because they don't have access to those sequencing facilities or lab facilities. And the impact shows up in our survival data. So between 2010 and 2015, a 5-year span, premature deaths due to cancer declined by about 20% in high-income countries, but only by 5% in low-income countries, many of which are in Africa. And digging into this, a lot of the rationale and the reason behind these disparities is that monoclonal antibodies are not as accessible on the continent. So the treatments that are revolutionizing cancer care, the treatments that are highly targeted, safer, are not widely available in Africa. And we actually wrote an article about this for TC Health earlier in the year. We did a series on monoclonal antibodies and the access to them. And it showed that fewer than a quarter of approved monoclonal antibodies are available in African markets, which means patients miss out on therapies that are standard of care everywhere else. And so even when we see that a treatment is approved, and we were talking about this when we had coffee, when you actually look at the funnel from it's approved by, let's say, NAFDAC in Nigeria, right, all the way down to it's paid for by the government, by the national insurance scheme, that funnel narrows very quickly and very significantly. So like I said, regulatory approval is the first barrier. Inclusion in essential medicines list is even rarer. So this is a list that the government and the Ministry of Health come together and decide are the most essential medicines that should be stocked across healthcare facilities in the country. When you look at how many monoclonal antibodies appear there, it's also very rare. And then when you look at reimbursement by national health insurance facilities in each country, which is the true measure of access, like the government through their national health insurance scheme is paying for treatments for patients, for its citizens, drops to almost zero in many countries, like actually zero. And so one of the reasons why we see these disparities in premature deaths due to cancer is because of the access to these therapies. And this kind of creates that stark mismatch. So high-income countries are debating the next generation of antibodies. They're debating cell and gene therapies where they take your cells, your immune cells, and re-engineer them in a factory and then infuse them back into your body, and then they fight the cancer on your behalf. Like all of these really highly innovative treatments. But many African patients are still struggling to get access to chemo, to get access to steroids, and some older regimens. And so the challenge isn't just about access, even though that's a pretty big challenge. I think a lot of it is that these therapies have been studied in African populations, but the numbers are so low that Africans remain underrepresented in the data. So even when patients have access, so even if we solve the problem of access tomorrow, I think one of the issues that would still remain is that there's still that uncertainty about how well the evidence reflects the African biology. And that underrepresentation of African genomic data in the development of modern cancer therapies is what we're focusing on today. And how leaders like Yaw, our guest, are working to kind of change that. And just to wrap this up, because I always like to focus on the future and what is actually being done and infuse that hope back into the narrative, one of the trends I've been seeing is we're seeing these new cancer centers popping up everywhere across the continent. And that's bringing some hope about patients can actually get treated at these centers, because some of these centers are public centers. Some examples: the National Sovereign Investment Authority in Nigeria. They have a flagship private-public partnership with Lagos University Teaching Hospital, Luth. And they have just commissioned in 2019 a cancer center at Luth to provide advanced radiotherapy, chemotherapy, and diagnostics services. And to date, they have treated over 10,000 patients. They've done over 8,000 radiotherapy sessions, 6,000 chemotherapy sessions. And that is reinvigorating cancer care right here in Lagos. We've also seen the NSIA expand. So they have a MedServe initiative that plans to scale to 26 diagnostic and oncology centers across all 6 of Nigeria's geopolitical zones. So they've signed MOUs, memorandums of understanding, with the Federal Ministry of Health in 2024 to establish new oncology and nuclear medicine centers in 6 federal tertiary hospitals. And the reason why it's so important that they're in federal hospitals is because those facilities are way more accessible to the general public than, for example, private facilities. And so we have in the MOU University of Benin Teaching Hospital in Benin City, Edo State, Ahmadu Bello University Teaching Hospital in Kaduna, University of Nigeria Teaching Hospital in Enugu, the Jos University Teaching Hospital in Plateau, and just so many others. And it also plans to upgrade existing diagnostic and oncology centers. So we're seeing a lot of these kind of pop up all across the continent. So we've seen some in Malawi, the International Blantyre Cancer Center. We've also seen the Malawi National Cancer Center. We've seen ones in Uganda. Uganda has the Gulu Regional Cancer Center, the Mbarara Regional Cancer Center, in Zambia Hospital Cancer Center. We're seeing some in Djibouti, in Niger, in Rwanda. So all of these new cancer centers are popping up everywhere, which is giving hope that, yes, we have this huge cancer burden, but there's more avenues and more facilities available to treat patients who are diagnosed with cancer in Africa. So that was my long spiel, just so everybody knows the landscape and the context in which we are going to be having this very exciting discussion with Yaw today. And the core question that anchors all of our discussions here at The Cure is, what does revolutionizing the African healthcare business model look like? And specifically, we're going to be asking, what does revolutionizing the African healthcare business model look like in the space of genomics, precision medicine, and oncology? And just a few months ago, as I was doing my research, I have to do my research. I do a bit of stalking. In London, at the London Calling 2025 conference, Dr. Yaw presented TACA, the African Cancer Atlas. And in your words, TACA is building a genomic database across Africa, East, West, South, Central. And hopefully this will revolutionize the way we think about cancer treatment. And that word, revolutionize, sits right at the heart of what this show is about. Because of Africa's genomic diversity is the richest in the world, and the work that you're doing with your team at Yemaachi, you're kind of leading this work, and it has the potential to become the foundation of a new kind of healthcare future, one that is led by Africa, by African data, African institutions, African vision, and for Africans. Again, ties to our theme of by Africa, for Africa. So today, I want to kind of understand the journey of Yemaachi and what you're doing currently and some of your plans for the future. And so we're going to be talking about genomics, sovereignty, how Africa can lead the next revolution in precision medicine, because it is possible. But before we kind of jump to all of those questions, I actually want to start with you and understand, when we first had our first call together, I think it was July or June, You mentioned how you've often described yourself as a scientist first, businessman second, and how that translates to Yemaachi. Yemaachi is science first, business second. But before we get into Yemaachi, I want to go back to understand, you spent time at KEMRI, at the West African Center for Cell Biology, the Francis Crick Institute. Can you talk us through the journey you've had in your career so far, and how did those experiences shape your vision for Yemaachi?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's exciting to be part of a show like this. So my background is, at least for the first part of it, quite typical for people who are interested in science. Got my PhD for a long time, very much focused on an academic career. So I sort of racked up postdocs, worked at KEMRI in Kenya, looking at malaria, immunology in children. Then I moved to the Crick in London, which is one of the premier research institutions in Europe, the largest single site center in the UK, and actually has about 60% of the scientists that focused on cancer. Interesting enough, at the time when I was at the Crick, I was not in a cancer lab, I was in a malaria immunology lab. But these opportunities allowed me to grow as a scientist. Science is competitive. Science, obviously, by its nature, is highly technical. And we do have a gap between the capacity on the African continent and the more advanced or more developed parts, or, well, maybe not developed. I don't like using the word more developed, higher income parts of the world. And I think what I'm grateful for, I'm grateful because I don't think it was a privilege to have the exposure that I've had. But training in America, doing research in parts of Africa, doing research in Europe, all of those experiences molded me into the scientist I am today and have been instrumental in allowing me to establish Yemaachi and get Yemaachi where it is now. My passion has always been science by Africans in Africa for the service of Africa, but also for the service of the world. I'm very uncomfortable when African problems are pigeonholed as just African health problems. Yes, some of the diseases we have in Africa are no longer problems elsewhere, like malaria. America used to have a huge malaria problem. They don't now. But African science can be more than just a solution for African problems. I think African science needs to be global. And so that is something that I've always, throughout my academic career, always felt a need to try to do something about, to try to show that African science could transcend the borders of the continent and that we could make meaningful contributions to global science. Oftentimes, when you see African scientists lauded for their achievements, it's, great African scientist, not great scientist who happens to be African. And I think there's a really important distinction there. There's always this step down. Like, you're good, but you're good by African standards. And I reject that. There are a lot of fantastic scientists in the West who are African, working in some of the greatest institutions in the world. So for me, it's always been, how can we do science in Africa at the level the quality that is done elsewhere? And how can we use that science to not only solve our problems, but solve the world's problems at the same time? So that's my background in sort of scientifically. Now, when I returned to Ghana in 2019, I was very much focused on establishing myself in an academic center in Ghana. So I took up a faculty position at the University of Ghana. WACBIP, the center you referred to, is a center within the University of Ghana, led by a very dynamic, relatively young professor. So I could identify with him. I've actually met him when he was in London winning some, I think a Pfizer award for something he had done. And so I was like, a Ghanaian has won an award. I need to try to meet him. So I actually literally engineered a meeting with him by sitting next to his wife at the ceremony.
Nice strategy.
I mean, and that conversation led to opportunities for me to return to Ghana and take up a position at the university. So when I returned to Ghana, my focus was I wanted to build myself up into, try to become a full professor before I was 45. Had all these plans about, training the next generation of scientists. But once I started doing that, probably about 6 months in, I began to feel a little bit restless. I felt that was very status quo.
Yeah.
The last 20 years have focused on building scientific capacity on the continent. The African Centers of Excellence program was a World Bank initiative that invested, I think, about $750 million in total over a span of probably about 10 to 12 years in centers of excellence. And there are some in Nigeria, there are some in Ghana. WACBIP, where I went, was one example. That center would not exist without that initial World Bank push. But all of these places were focused on training. H3 Africa, you mentioned, big genomics initiative, but its primary objective was actually building capacity. They've trained a lot of bioinformaticians. They created some biobanks, but it was like, okay, what's the next step? And as somebody who was now in the business of training, as I looked at my own PhD students or my own master's students, I asked myself, where would they work? If they did not come back and work with me at the university, and of course there are limited slots open at the universities, they'll probably leave Ghana or leave Africa because there weren't exciting science-based jobs for them to do outside of academia. So if they didn't want to teach, if they didn't want to be like me and train the next generation of people, they would leave and go work for pharma or biotech companies in San Francisco or in Boston or in Cambridge or elsewhere. So I began to feel that the next phase of capacity building had to focus on job creation. Brain drain is not going to be reversed just by training. We often see statistics. Africa needs another 1,000 PhDs. I actually dispute that. Africa has enough PhDs. They're not just in Africa. So our problem, yes, we need to train. But when you try to solve brain drain purely by training, it's equivalent to you have a leaky tub, and you make the tap bigger. So the drain is still open, and so water is still flowing out. But you decided that you're going to solve it by creating a very big tap so that you overcome the drain by just filling it up. And to me, that is not sustainable and it's wasteful. We need to, yes, train more people, but we need to plug the hole. We need to plug the drain. And you plug the drain by creating good job opportunities. We all want to be home. We all want to eat fufu or pounded yam or whatever your preference is.
Nigerian jollof.
Or Nigeria, well, perhaps. We won't go there. I came here with waving the peace flag. So. But anyway, yes, you want to eat Nigerian jollof or Ghanaian jollof or maybe Senegalese jollof, which is
that's
the original.
always the curve.
Yeah, exactly. But you also have to look after your family. You have responsibilities. You want to live a comfortable life. So you want to earn a good wage. And maybe more importantly for most scientists, you want to practice the science that you know how to do. It's very frustrating to read stuff in books and not have the equipment or the resources to show your true potential. So that is really why a lot of scientists leave, because they want to express themselves. Science it's not quite art, but it's a form of expression. When you do an experiment that works really well, it's like painting a beautiful painting. Now, if you are painting with just one brush and two colors, it's not fun. I'd rather go somewhere where I have the full palette available. So the vision behind Yemaachi was Africa needs science industry. We need places where scientists can express themselves. And if you look at the West, you look at Europe, North America, the activities in science are primarily actually now occurring in private sector. Yes, they have the NIH in America and they have big public funding for research, but 75% of R&D happens in the private sector in America. So despite big government funding, big public sources of money for research that we hear about, the biggest money in research is actually coming from the private sector. It's coming from big pharma, big biotech. And so if Africa is going to make that transition, we need our own businesses. We hear about declarations like, the Khartoum Declaration by the African Union talking about investing 1% of GDP in R&D. America is around 2.4%. The global average is around 1.5. Across Africa, it's 0.3 to 0.5% of GDP invested in R&D. No country has ever crossed the 1% threshold without private sector becoming the majority investor in R&D. So till private sector overtakes the public sector, you never pass 1%. And yet our presidents, I think it was 2007 or so, really quite a while ago, made that declaration. Everybody still talks about we need to invest in R&D. It's actually not the government's job to find the money. It's actually the private sector who has to find that money. Government's job is to create an enabling environment. So, and up till date, we still hear these declarations. People talk about increasing investment in healthcare. So we want a certain proportion of the government budget to be in healthcare. I feel like in Africa, we put way too much pressure or way too much emphasis on what the government needs to do, when in reality, what we really need is private investment in some of these areas that will then allow the public sector to have the resources it requires. Of course, yes, there's waste, there's corruption, we need to tighten all those things.
Yeah.
But the emphasis is too much on what will the government do for me.
Mm.
And I think the question is, what can I do for myself? What can I do for my country? How can the government enable me to do those things better? But ultimately, Africa's future is going to be driven by private sector. Look at Asia. It was private sector. It was public-private partnership. Singapore has become a hub for biotech, an intentional position they took. And it's now driven primarily by private money, even though government facilitated. So the vision behind Yemaachi was really, I want to create jobs for scientists. I want to see my students in jobs here.
Yeah.
And if I don't create the jobs for them, where will they go? And then selfishly, it was kind of like, if I don't try this, I'll be that old man sitting in the corner. In 20 years, one of these young people actually succeeds. And I'll be like, I had that idea. I could have done it, but I chose not to. And I was like, I didn't want to be that guy. So my evolution from somebody very much focused on an academic career to somebody who is now trying to be an entrepreneur in science was almost forced upon me by the conditions I met and I saw surrounding me. And this was my brain drain response, because without Yemaachi, I probably would have left again. And I didn't want to leave Ghana a second time. I already spent 20 years training and doing all kinds of things abroad. I wanted to stay in Ghana. But I felt I needed something that was bigger, and hopefully ultimately would create sustainability. In the current landscape, everybody is an expert. Or USAID is gone. Look at how unsustainable Africa's health system is. 5 years ago, when Yemaachi started, we were saying the same thing. All the grants are from our overseas. H3 Africa is NIH money and welcome. You mentioned it. There was no African money in H3 Africa. I myself lost a grant during COVID because the UK government decided to cut the funding. So I'd spent 9 months securing a very competitive Royal Society grant, only to get a letter congratulating me and at the same time telling me I'll not get any money. So congratulating me for being picked. So your science is fantastic. We're really happy to we would love to give you the fellowship. However, unfortunately, the Prime Minister of the UK has cut ODI, and so all our funding for this fellowship is cut. That African science should not be at the whim or the it should not be at the pleasure
or the
mercy of a foreign government. Right. So that was the final straw. It was sort of, you know what, we need to build something that is sustainable. But I cannot expect my government necessarily to have the resources to support me to the level I need to be supported. So how can I make my science commercially viable? And I think that is the final piece. We ask our governments a lot. When you hear the sovereignty arguments these days, it's all focused once again on Ghana and Nigeria setting up NIH-like structures. Now, I'm fully supportive of public money for research. I think that is very important. But I think we need to also understand science, biotech, life science is highly capital intensive. $1 million does not go very far. Our governments, even when you remove all the additional corruption or other issues, our governments have significant strains on their budget. They have to build roads and other very basic infrastructure. So investing 10, 20, $100 million in biotech, it's not necessarily the most politically expedient thing for a politician to do, because the fruits of that will happen in more than 5 years or 4 years, which is the election cycle. So we have to understand the constraints our politicians are under. And so I think that is why we need to also think of new ways to fund. And I think that's where private sector comes in. And from that position, we can engage with governments to help them to create an enabling environment. So whereas they may not always have cash to give us in grants the way the NIH does, could they provide other incentives? So they provide tax incentives and other things to help. So I'm sure we'll get to that. But just myself trying to paint a picture of all the different things that were whirling around 5 years ago and continue to whirl around as we build Yemaachi. And really, the final thing I'll say is Yemaachi is meant to hopefully be a catalyst, an example that will inspire young African scientists coming up to even go beyond where we are, to believe that it is possible. And really to be the next revolution. You talked about revolutionize. I think African biotech is the next wave in global biotech. If we harness it well, it can be the engine that drives economic development on this continent for the next, for many decades. We have everything at our disposal. We have already the genetic diversity, the biodiversity. We have all the raw materials that could spur this industry. What we, however, need to do is to have the right strategy, have the attention to detail, have the focus on excellence, and the governmental support at certain levels to allow it to happen.
Yeah.
But all the pieces are in place. We just need a few people to do the hard work to get it going. And that's what we are trying to be part of.
Yeah. I love that. I have two responses to that. The first one being, I love when you said that was my personal response to the brain drain problem, because I feel like, what would the world look like? What would Africa look like if we each had that kind of motivating spirit? Yes, like we said, we just spoke about this at coffee. Africans love to complain about how many problems we have in Africa. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of problems. But what if we flipped the script and instead talked about what is our personal response to these problems? Not just in healthcare, but even in all sectors. I think that would change a lot. And then my second point was towards the end, when you were talking about how do we grow the biotech sector, etc. When you think, these are all the things that led to me founding Yemaachi. I just think it's interesting how this is the second mention of the biopharma revolution in Africa on this podcast. So the first episode we had with Charles, who's the CEO of Cygen, a pharma company, and he had recently posted on his LinkedIn a couple months ago that the Nigerian or African biopharma revolution is here. And you have just mentioned the biopharma revolution, or the next wave of biopharma revolution is going to be in Africa if we play our cards right. Yeah. So it to me, it just feels, and I said this in the pilot episode, there's something in the air that feels tangible, that if we just play our cards right, if we take the opportunity that we have right now in front of us, that we could see some pretty catalytic changes happening. So I find that very interesting. I think my only follow-up question, because you've answered quite a few of the questions I had on your backstory, is why the focus on cancer for Yemaachi?
So there are a variety of reasons. I mean, one is personal. I lost my father to cancer in 2008. Up until then, as an immunologist, I mean, my training is my interest primarily academically has been T cells and T cell immunology, understanding how our immune systems work, and especially that subset that involves T cells, or and maybe to some extent B cells. Although my favorite, as scientists, we are geeky, so my favorite cell in the body is the T cell.
Okay, good to know.
But I'd very much be focused on infectious disease because I grew up having malaria as a kid. I know malaria is a big problem. Well, obviously, we know about HIV and tuberculosis, and in America, those diseases are fringe. So there's, when you think of global health research, it's usually around the infectious diseases.
Yeah.
So even as an African scientist, that was where my interest was. I didn't know that much about cancer. The stats you read, obviously I know them now, but before my dad got sick, I didn't really view cancer. Cancer is
it felt
the
like a Western
problem. Exactly. Africa, we have malaria and things like that. But my dad had liver cancer. And then I find, the mortality for liver cancer is higher. The whole world, the highest mortality is in West Africa. I had no idea. And if I go to the wards in Accra, Kolebu Teaching Hospitals, are Ghana's largest hospital, liver cancer is just rife. And then you look into the data and you find liver cancer, like I said, across West Africa.
Yeah.
And so you begin to realize how big an issue cancer actually is. So that's part of the reason. But the main reason, so the emotional side of cancer is obviously losing my dad. But the reason Yemaachi is focused on cancer is actually more pragmatic and speaks to my vision for Africa having a role in global life science research. Cancer is a global problem.
Yeah.
It's not an African problem. And I wanted my company to solve the world's problems from Africa. I have a bit of Wakanda kind of aspirations in me. And I felt that African science, as I said in the very beginning, African science has a voice beyond just solving African problems. And so it was very important for strategically, commercially, that the work we do would appeal to a global audience, to a global market. Africa has a big population, but our market from a pharma perspective is still viewed as small because of the economic situation of many patients. People just we don't have a reimbursement system like you have in other parts of the world, like you said. And so the ability to pay for drugs is much lower.
Yeah, I think the stats are like 1% of monoclonal antibody sales happen in Africa.
And pharma's motivations to invest the billions of dollars required to bring a new monoclonal antibody to market are because when they sell it in America, one single treatment is can be as high as $100,000. So that they will recoup many times over the huge investments that are required. When you think about deploying some of or diseases that are in Africa that you can maybe charge $2 or $3 for a treatment. It's why we haven't had a new anti-malarial in a long time. It's why antibiotics seem to be, unless they are funded by philanthropy, nobody wants to touch that research. Now, I do, from an equity or a justice perspective, that's not right, and we can have a whole episode, I'm sure, on health equity. But when you build a business, you also have to be pragmatic. And so Yemaachi is focused on cancer because guess what? Cancer affects high income, it affects low income. And we want to make the case that the work we do will also be commercially useful in the big markets. So that was occupying a niche that was open. Infectious disease is quite crowded with a lot of initiatives. NCDs are a growing problem in Africa, but no one is paying attention. And also happens to sit at the intersection between high income interest and low income interest. And I think my feeling is some parts of African biotech are going to, for now, have to strike that balance because we need to attract a lot of investment to get where we need to go. We need to make strong business cases. And we cannot overlook the fact that right now the African market is small and fragmented. So if you are going to attract an investor today, you need to make a case for how you're going to get into those big markets. And so to me, the solution is to pick diseases that are also of high priority, whether it is cancer, cardiometabolic. There are certain disease types that are our problem, but also, to lack of a better word, their problem. And so we need to sit in that middle. Then as we build more resources, we can also dedicate some resources to problems that are more quote unquote Africa specific, like the malarias and so on. And that is where I'm learning the business, as a scientist, let's do the science, let's study malaria because it's nobody cares about it but us. When you begin to build a business, you need to balance that with pragmatism. Because you need to return on your investors want to see a return on their investment. And so you need to begin to make that case. But I think also, it also allows you to redefine how African science is viewed. From the very beginning, I said, I don't think it's right that African science is always put in a box, that you're great, but you're for Africa. I want to be great on the global level. The fact that I'm African is secondary to the greatness that I'm achieving. And I think that also happens when we tackle these problems. Nobel Prize was announced this week. It was an immunologist. These days, it always seems to be an immunologist, but it was people who discovered T regulatory cells, which are really important in the immunotherapy space, especially for autoimmune diseases, right? When are we going to see Nobel Prizes awarded to African scientists? Not Peace Prize. Peace Prize we can get, and Wole Soyinka got literature. We want physics and chemistry, right? But we do that when we do globally relevant work. So Yemaachi is trying to do that. And cancer, I think, provides us with an avenue to do that, and to demonstrate the applicability of African research to problems that transcend any region.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, to me, as you were talking, I never really saw that angle of you want to treat or focus on a disease area that is global, that affects everybody. Because I think Africa is starting to look very similar to the rest of the world, but still very different, because we still do have infectious diseases kind of just still running rampage, but we're starting to look similar to more Western or higher income markets when it comes to chronic disease. we're starting to see, well, not starting, cancer rates are rising, rates of cardiometabolic diseases, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, even obesity, things like that are rising. And with those come the need for not just more expensive treatments, but health systems built to identify and treat those patients.
I mean, I think the biggest challenge we face, why cancer is such a threat to Africa, is most of our health systems are very much holdovers from colonial tropical medicine.
Yeah.
If you go to our hospitals, they still look, I mean, you know, like many of our public hospitals still look the way the British built them. All right, for those of us who were former British colonies. And the focus there was tropical medicine, which is primarily acute infections, right? Chronic disease management is very different. It's more expensive, it's long, it requires many different inputs. It's not just treatment, it's management. So you need all the diagnostics and all the management, whether it's dialysis or, you know, tests to see where your glucose levels or, you know, treatment courses for cancer can be 2 or 3 years long. People have to come in for chemo every so often, and they need supportive care, blood transfusion. I mean, how many children with leukemia die in Africa because there was no blood?
Yeah.
When do you ever hear of a blood stock out in big hospitals in the US? You never. But in Africa, every time, in fact, in Ghana, if you want to get blood for your family member, you have to go and donate.
Yeah.
Because the blood bank doesn't have enough blood. So our health systems currently are really not kitted out for disease management of these sort of diseases. Now, with the sense of excellence you described, that is beginning to change. And I would argue it's not just about providing access, but now Africa is a really good place to begin to think about trials.
Yeah.
Because you said, you know, the drugs are not trialed. It's not about using Africans as guinea pigs. We need to change that mindset. It's about being included in the trial so that when the drug hits the market, you have strong conviction that this drug will work.
Yeah.
The problem why many trials don't, Africa gets a very, very small percentage of global clinical trials, and they're usually all in either sickle or malaria or some infectious disease. Oncology trials, hardly any. Is because they don't, pharma doesn't really see the capacity in our hospitals to run trials. And pharma is not going to come and build a clinical trial facility for you. That's something you're going to have to do and then attract their business.
Yeah.
Clinical trials can be incredibly lucrative for our hospitals. So some of these centers of excellence begin to provide opportunities for these types of research. And I think these are things we need to take advantage of.
Yeah.
Because our dual burden of infection and NCDs is actually a really useful, you know, it's a terrible thing on the one hand, from a healthcare perspective, but the silver lining is it means we are a really useful place to begin to understand what drives these diseases.
Yeah.
So we need to capitalize on those. It's like taking a negative and making it a positive, but do so driven from here. We don't want to be guinea pigs, which means we don't want the science to be led from outside and we are just the subjects. We want our scientists to lead the science and work with global partners. There's nothing wrong with collaboration. Let's work with, you know, the MD Andersons, the Dana-Farbers, the biggest institutions in the world. No problem. But if our scientists are key leaders in these research, then they will obviously, you know, serve as that, you know, that gut check or that to make sure that the work is being done with our interests at heart. But that only happens if we take the initiative. You know, in all spheres of life, if you sit back and become a passenger, you will be taken advantage of.
Yeah.
Because even unintentionally, even well-meaning people will take advantage of you because they are driving in one direction. You've chosen to be a passenger. So where the car goes, you will follow. But if you want to direct, then be a driver as well.
Yeah.
We are capable of doing it. Do the hard work. Come up with an innovative question. Look for money. Find partners. Invite them on your terms. Now you are driving the bus or the boat or whatever vehicle together, right? So I think that is the challenge we have or we need to take on. We can whinge and agonize as much as we want, but we need to start organizing. You know, somebody once said, Africa, we agonize. We need to stop agonizing and start organizing. We have a lot of attractive features within our ecosystem that could serve global R&D.
Yeah.
But it will only work for Africa or for our benefit if we lead. So we should take that initiative and then reach out for partnership and support where necessary, and then co-lead these initiatives, or some cases solo lead the initiatives with partners.
Yeah.
So I think I fully agree. The time for the revolution is now. It's happening. The question is, will it benefit us or not? The revolution is going to happen. It's going to, in some ways, run through Africa. Now, does it run through Africa the way everything else historically has run through Africa, where you don't really see what benefits? You see the benefits outside. You don't see the benefits on the continent. Or is it going to run through Africa like a river that spawns a whole oasis of growth around it? Now, that's what I hope can happen.
Yeah.
But that only happens if the initiative is ours.
Yeah.
If we are the ones saying, these are our ideas. We are willing to do the hard work. We will work with you. We need resources. We need expertise. But we are going to do the hard work. We are going to take we're going to own the process. Then it'll flow through. It'll benefit the rest of the world, but it will really benefit us. And we'll see the results for many, many years to come.
Yeah. That just fired me up. That was like I'm very pumped now for the African biopharma revolution that is going to happen.
Oh, it's already happening.
But I think maybe we can pivot to the case for African genomics. I know I went on and on my nerdy rabbit hole, but we've kind of discussed at length about how African populations carry the most genetically diverse DNA in the world.
Yep.
As a scientist, could you explain how that genetic diversity shapes the way that diseases express themselves in Africans and how Africans respond to drugs? Like, why does, and I know you mentioned the linkage disequilibrium. See, I'm learning something new every day. How that translates to phenotypes and being able to link genotype, phenotype.
Yeah.
But if you could just dig into that a bit more,
sure.
Maybe your opportunity to geek out a bit before we go into the business side of things. Yeah. I would love to just hear about that.
Sure. And I think actually it links to the business, because I think genomics, when we think of a hook, as I'm learning business, you always have to have that hook that gets you into a market or gets you into a conversation. Genomics is Africa's hook into global biotech. And we cannot underestimate how important it is. Because we want our science to be relevant globally. Why is our science relevant globally? Because our genomes are relevant globally. So genomics, I think, is going to be the first, maybe the foundational platform upon which African biotech builds.
Yeah.
Another one could be biodiversity. We have so much animal and plant biodiversity on this continent. That could be a whole area in drug development, plant-based drugs. We've not exhausted all the, hopefully we don't cut down all our trees before we get there. But there's a lot to explore there. But on the human level, especially in the age of precision medicine, right now, medicine globally is going precision. AI we haven't even yet started talking about AI, but that's going to be a big part of this too. But the theme in medicine right now is precision, targeted therapies to the individual. Now, this was spurred by the original genomics revolution, which was launched when the first human genome was published.
Yeah.
So in 2003, we finally completed the sequencing of the human genome, meaning we characterized all the nucleotides, to use the word. The AT, it's basically 4 letters in an alphabet that are arranged on our chromosomes. So chromosomes are like the books, and each of us has 23 pairs of chromosomes. And then within the books, you have letters.
Yeah.
And the letters, and instead of having however many we have in the English alphabet, in our case, we have A, T, C, and G. And the sequence of those letters determines everything about you.
Yeah.
Determines the color of your hair, determines the color of your eyes, your skin color. It determines whether you are at risk of developing breast cancer, determines how you respond to drug A versus drug B.
Yeah.
I mean, the implications of your genes are almost infinite. Your genes are you.
Yeah.
Right? It is, and you are a reflection of your mom and dad's genes that came together to produce you. So the Human Genome Project was our ability to, for the very first time, for the whole genome, for all the genes in our body, have that data set that says, in this person, it's A, T, C, G, blah, 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 and group them in different genes. 2003, that's when the first one, it cost, I think, over $1 billion to do. And it was a race between, in the end, they worked together, but it was a US team and a UK team, and it was all, geeky excitement. 2003, it launched. Since then, the technology has got much, much cheaper. Companies, have built new platforms. So we've had revolutions in genomics. So you've gone from the way sequencing was done in 2003. Now you have next generation sequencing, which makes it basically you can sequence much quicker and much cheaper because you can do a lot of these processes in parallel.
Yeah.
So you have these really massive, highly powered devices that can read a human genome. Now, I told you the first one took years to do. Now I can do your genome in 48 hours. Right? In Accra, actually, at Yemaachi, plug.
Our site visit is pending.
Oh, yes. So there's been a huge revolution in the technology. It's much easier now and much cheaper. Now you can do it for, a few $100 to $1,000 versus $1 billion before.
Yeah.
Now, so over that time, we've sequenced hundreds of millions of people. Now, here's the but. But less than 3% of those people are Black. 80% of those people are European. So what we know about the human genome is primarily people of European ancestry.
Yeah.
Now, yes, 99 point whatever percent of our genomes are the same across human beings. But it's that little point something percent that can distinguish us from one another and can distinguish our predisposition to a particular disease. So it's not really a black or white issue.
Yeah.
It's really a human diversity issue. As you said in the beginning, two Africans are more different from one another than one of those Africans and a European.
Yeah.
So even though when you looked at them stand, you say, oh, those two are Black and this person is white. Actually, one of those Black people is more similar to the white person than the two Black people are more different from each other at a genetic level. If you just took their DNA and you grouped it according to DNA, the Black people will be further apart. We're just that diverse.
Yeah.
And so genomics as a discipline or as an area of science has on one level experienced significant growth because the technology has now allowed us to interrogate it, and we've developed all these drugs thanks to genomic revolution. Right? We've discovered genes that predispose you to a disease like BRCA, BRCA, breast cancer. Now there are tests that women can go for to test to see whether or not they have specific mutations in BRCA. That would mean their risk for breast cancer is higher than somebody else. Angelina Jolie made this famous because she took the test and opted to get a double mastectomy because her risk of breast cancer was higher. She didn't want to wait to get it, so she just had the mastectomy. That was thanks to BRCA testing. And there are a variety of drugs that have been developed on the market now that target specific mutations that were uncovered by doing genomic research. So there's been considerable development. And some of the most valuable drugs in the world, Keytruda, $30 billion a year, single drug, developed thanks to
20 plus indications.
Oh, yes.
Like if you look at the list for Keytruda, it can treat everything.
It's monoclonal.
Yeah, monoclonal antibody.
But so that has been a huge revolution. On the other side, though, since 2003, we still have less than 3% of that data coming from Black people. I argue that the moment we figured out in 2003 how to sequence, they should have built a center somewhere in Lagos or somewhere in Congo or somewhere in Africa anyway, and began to sequence African people. Because this is the cradle of life. This is where our species came from. If you want to understand human health, you study African people. But instead, for 20 years, we've been studying everything but. So we have a huge data gap between people of European ancestry who are quite homogeneous, quite similar to one another, with the most diverse population on the planet. And so that is where the African revolution. So I think the next genomic revolution is actually, so we're talking about biotech revolution. It will be built upon the next genomic revolution, which is on the African continent. There's a reason why NIH spent several $1 million on H3 Africa. It's not out of, I think
it's not fully
it's
altruistic.
not fully altruistic.
Yeah.
Because they have to, it's past US taxpayer money, has to be justified. It was because it's good science. Because if you want to do genomics, human genomics, you have to do African genomics, right? So that is why Wellcome and NIH would invest such money in a project like H3 Africa. So I think that is the foundational piece, is that African genes are really useful to understand health. There are certain diseases or certain conditions that are easier to detect. I already talked about linkage disequilibrium, but there are a number of indications. There are certain genes that have been discovered from studying African populations and drugs that have come out of it. So certain drugs for high cholesterol and certain conditions like chronic kidney disease. Some of those indications were discovered thanks to studying predominantly Black populations. And the drugs are now on the market and serving white people and Asian people just as well. Right. Now, pharmacogenomics, final point, just touch on your question, is pharmacogenomics is this idea that different drugs are metabolized differently. So even if it's not a monoclonal or something that's going to bind a target, if it's a chemical goes to your liver, gets metabolized, and that's how the drug works.
Yeah.
Now, in our liver, we have enzymes that break down drugs. It so happens that those enzymes are some of the most genetically variant aspects in our body. So between the two of us, we probably have different expression of different variants of those drug metabolizing enzymes, which means that you and I may take the same drug and I may metabolize it much quicker, which means it will move through my system very quickly, and you may take a really long time to metabolize it, meaning that the effective dosing for the two of us will be different.
Yeah.
So that is the field of pharmacogenomics tries to map people's drug metabolism or their genetic predisposition to metabolize different drugs differently based on the expression of these specific genes. So it raises the question that there may be drugs that have been trialed in certain populations.
Yeah.
Because we already know Africans don't typically feature in clinical trials. The drug dose is set based upon studies in a European population. So they'll say, 20 milligrams per body weight, blah, blah, blah. The drug will finally make its way to Africa. We'll say 20 milligrams.
Yeah.
Now that may work in you. I may need 10.
Yeah.
And there are actually good examples where trials have been done here that have had to be stopped or have to be modified because they realized that certain groups of people were getting way too much because they're metabolizing it differently from other people. So pharmacogenomics is this area where it's sort of trying to, once again, within the spirit of precision medicine, can we look at your genes before we give you the drug and determine your dose based on that? In order to do that, you need to map the diversity that exists. So there's a huge opportunity to use to leverage African genetic data to improve how drugs are used. Because if you find a better dose, then it will be more effective and it will have a better outcome. And you also minimize negative effects of drugs, where sometimes you can have toxicity because you've given too much of a particular drug.
Yeah.
So, recognizing the rich diversity of the African continent allows us to begin to do such research so that eventually you get a situation where you have dosing guidelines.
Yeah.
And so whether you are in Europe or in Asia or in Africa, a quick test, you are in category A, so this is your dose versus you are in category B. That's precision medicine, right? But it requires an understanding of human genetic diversity. And once again, guess what? Where is the human diversity located? On the African continent. You can't do this in Europe. They only have a few subtypes.
Yeah.
So once again, Africa's utility to global drug development is our diversity. We just need to make sure that work benefits us.
Yeah. I think those points that you just raised, well, first of all, I didn't know just how the pharmacogenetics impacted even just things like dosing. When I think about it, I just think maybe you'll discover a new biomarker other than BRCA. Maybe you discover a new one because you've studied African patients. But it's even beneficial for the drugs that already exist.
Absolutely.
To optimize dosing, which I didn't consider.
If you check PubMed, Yemaachi, we just released a paper in August. We called it Precision Medicine on a Budget. And so what I asked my team to do was take 2 cancer chemo drugs. So they are cheap, they're off patent, they are readily available in every clinic or hospital in Africa. Capecitabine and cyclophosphamide.
Yeah.
There is evidence, there's data already on certain genes or genetic variants that either lead to increased toxicity in certain individuals or decreased efficacy.
Okay.
So that is already published. So in this case, we didn't do any new sequencing. We just said, okay, we know these are 2 drugs that are currently in use. We know a number of people have published reports and research showing that people with specific genetic variants will either have increased toxicity or reduce efficacy of these drugs.
Yeah.
What we did was then, okay, can we look at existing databases, albeit there's limited black data, but for the little data that's there, can we show that the frequency of these genetic variants differs based on genetic ancestry? So basically, these toxicity variants, are they higher or lower in Africans versus Europeans or Asians? So we did that, and we just published it recently. And to sort of spoil the story, yes, we found differences.
Yeah.
So these are known drugs with known mechanisms. And we found that there are certain known genetic variants that link to how well these drugs work.
Yeah.
And those frequencies differ from different groups.
Yeah.
So the downstream application of this study is that you could eventually get to a point where you developed a companion diagnostic, even for these relatively old school drugs, where you'd say, oh, you're taking capecitabine or cyclophosphamide, you are in this category where you are more likely to have a toxicity or a lower efficacy, and so would have to modify your dose. So, of course, a lot more work would have to be done to tailor it. But that is how, you're exactly right. Pharmacogenomics and precision medicine is not just new drugs, new biomarkers. It could potentially extend the life of existing drugs. And that is really important for places like us that are lower resourced. Cheap drugs need to work really well. Because that's what we can afford. We need to stretch them. And so genomics can help us stretch, because now we can segment different groups of people and say, oh, you could benefit from this dose, you could benefit from that dose. So that's actually something we just published, just showing the difference in the genetic diversity and making the case that even for existing drugs, a bit of genomic testing could make those drugs more effective or less dangerous.
So on the topic of pharmacogenetics and how it impacts drugs and some of the studies that you've published, I actually wanted to, jump into that a bit further, like further deep dive, because you've been leading some fascinating studies. I mean, there's the AMBER study, Alive Heritage, the African Cancer Study, and many others. You've already walked through one, and a big kind of insight or something that it revealed about even how we can optimize treatment for patients. I think another one is the AMBER study, which your team recently published. For context, this was a prospective observational trial in Ghana. You enrolled 20 newly diagnosed women with metastatic breast cancer at Cape Coast Teaching Hospital. And each patient had both, and this is where I'm going to get into some nitty gritty, so please layer in your thoughts. Each patient had both a traditional tissue biopsy and a plasma cfDNA liquid biopsy.
Cell-free DNA,
and they were analyzed with next-gen sequencing, obviously, with Yemaachi. The liquid biopsy is, because I had to research this for myself, liquid biopsy is a way of testing for cancer using a simple blood sample instead of cutting out a piece of a tumor tissue or biopsying tumor tissue. And so inside our blood, dying cells release these tiny fragments of DNA called cell-free DNA. And when those fragments come from tumor cells, they're called circulating tumor DNA.
Precisely.
Are you sure you won't give me an honorary PhD?
We can talk about it now. You need to come to Accra.
Yeah, I do. I need to first visit the site and all those extracurricular activities. But by collecting a tube of blood and sequencing that cfDNA, scientists can detect mutations or other genetic changes linked to that cancer without needing surgery or invasive biopsies, etc. So back to AMBER. So that study, the results were, I found them quite fascinating. So the liquid biopsies detected 42 mutations in 17 of the 20 patients, including variants like BRCA1 that we've already talked about and others that have been linked to African ancestry. But importantly, about a third of the women had mutations that were considered actionable. And what this means that they could change the course of treatment because they either point to drugs already or clinical trials for drugs that could work for that mutation. And the conclusion was that liquid biopsy could not just be feasible, but it's perhaps better suited for certain African clinical contexts where tissue processing, surgery, invasive procedures is often a bottleneck. So, I mean, I found these results fascinating, but my question to you is, I mean, what did you find anything surprising about these results? How do you see these results and other studies that you're working on kind of shaping the way cancer is diagnosed and treated in Africa going forward?
So, yes, I think you've done a really good job summarizing AMBER. It was actually our very first study. AMBER was sort of was it the first or the second study at Yemaachi? We actually did it in partnership with a Palo Alto and Singapore-based liquid biopsy company called Lucence. So the CEO of Lucence and I go way back. So it's kind of like, we worked together a long time ago when we were still training. He was many years ahead of me. So I was kind of his assistant. And so when I started Yemaachi, I knew he had started Lucence. So I reached out and it seemed like a natural fit for us to do a little project together. And so Lucence they specialize in making, they are a molecular diagnostic company that makes tests for cancer. And they are focusing on liquid biopsy. So you're exactly right. Liquid biopsy, there are a number of US and European companies focused on liquid biopsy for the simple fact that it's less invasive.
Yeah.
So the idea of using a blood sample. So imagine the ambition is eventually you get to a point where as part of your yearly health check, you get a quick blood sample and it will tell you if you have cancer.
This sounds like well, let me not bring it up.
Not Theranos. No. So
it's kind of like what Theranos was supposed to be.
Yes.
But this is real science, real.
Theranos claimed to be there. They were not.
Yes, exactly.
The truth is, we will probably get that one day. There are companies like Grail and others that are working on this, and Lucence is one.
Yeah.
Currently, a lot of the focus, what is possible right now, is primarily people who already have cancer being able to use these techniques to manage them, to follow them up, to know whether or not they are in remission or whether the cancer is coming back.
Yeah.
And in some cases, also to direct their therapy. So using a genetic test like this, you can determine which mutations are in the cancer.
Yeah.
And so you can align them with specific targeted therapies that might be available. The use of liquid biopsy as a sort of a screening early detection device or tool is still being fine-tuned because about limit of detection, right? You don't want to give somebody a test and say, oh, you're fine, but in fact they had cancer, but your test didn't detect it.
Yeah.
So that I think the fine-tuning is now trying to happen where you drive the sensitivity of the tests. But they are certainly where a lot of the future is coming, using blood as an easy, simple, less invasive way. What we were interested in doing with Lucence was they had their test is already FDA approved. It's in the US, but it never explored its usefulness in a predominantly black population because they are Asia. They were using it in Asia. It's used across Asia. So for Asian populations, used in the US predominantly in white populations. So we provided an opportunity for us to do the Lucence test, but in Africa.
Oh, interesting.
And also to assess the utility of the blood versus tissue, because even as we go into genomics or molecular diagnostics, a lot of the current tests focus on tissue biopsies.
Yeah.
So in America, if a woman has breast cancer, her tissue biopsy is usually what is sent for sequencing. So the question was, does blood also offer certain advantages to the tissue? Because if the tissue is not processed properly, you get a lot of false negatives because the tissue is degraded, the DNA is messed up, and when you sequence it, you don't get anything. So this Lucence study is not really a trial, but it's more of a study that allowed us to kind of, on a very small scale, in not even the largest hospital in Ghana, so not a rural hospital, but more of a regional hospital, allow us to kind of assess whether this would work and whether we'd get anything interesting.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. We found that 30% of the women had actionable. Now, actionable, you're a pharma person, actionable could be, I can tell you it's actionable from the science, but the drugs are not available, so is it really actionable? So that was one of the questions we raised in the discussion. With 30% of these women would benefit from targeted therapy. Unfortunately, that therapy is not available in Ghana. But at least it shows that if we had these tests, then we could make a case for the drugs to be made accessible. And I think that's something we need to also do. A lot of the time, the reason the drugs are not here is we say we don't have the companion diagnostic to detect it. We showed that we can do the companion diagnostic, so perhaps now the argument needs to shift to can we get the drugs in? On the other side, we also found a bunch of mutations that were of unknown significance. Oftentimes, when you sequence cancer patients of African descent, you get lots of what are called VUSs, variants of unknown significance. It doesn't mean they are not pathogenic. It just means they've never been seen before and we don't know what they do. Once again, because very few of us have been sequenced. So all the pathogenic variants were found within predominantly European people. African people may have other variants that are also pathogenic but are just currently not characterized. And then the final thing, as you said, was the blood versus the tissue. We found that there was a significant drop-off in the quality of the data when we used tissue, partly because the tissue was overfixed, it spent too long in formalin, degraded the DNA, you couldn't get anything useful. So if our molecular genetics was based entirely on tissue, very few patients would have had usable samples. On the blood side, everything was perfect. So once again, the liquid biopsy as a tool to manage an already diagnosed person's cancer is potentially something that we should be looking at on the continent. So that was really, it's a small, simple study, but I think really spoke to, once again, the fact that Africa doesn't have to wait so long. Like high tech can work with us.
Yeah.
And high tech can sometimes even solve some of the structural problems. Because you could say, okay, go and make sure you fix your tissue well. Yeah, we can sort it out. But if I don't need to use tissue at all, I can use blood. All of a sudden, I've leapfrogged that problem. And I think, obviously, in Africa, we keep talking about leapfrogging in different sectors. I think, once again, some of these technologies provide leapfrog opportunities.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. Yeah, I didn't even have all this context behind the study. So even just hearing that makes the findings even more relevant and revolutionizing. I think we can use that word. It's appropriate. But let's transition. I want you to tell me about TACA. So the African Cancer Atlas. It's a big project that you have embarked on at Yemaachi.
Yep.
And I just kind of want you to talk us through what's the vision, why does it matter? I know there's the TCGA that was done in the US. Why is it appropriate for us to have TACA in Africa? And yeah, what are your plans for that?
So TACA is really, I would call it Yemaachi's flagship project at the moment. All the other projects we've done up to now were leading up to TACA. They were small, quite academic pilot studies to demonstrate Yemaachi's capacity. Because once again, you need to, in science, you need to build credibility. This work we do is it's very expensive. We need to secure support either from pharma, philanthropy, investors, whoever, and they all want to see quote unquote traction and they want to see scientific credibility. So as a young startup coming out of nowhere, we had to build that. We're still building it. So our initial projects were scaled to try to just provide proof of concept. Sequence a couple hundred whole exomes from women in Ghana, or do 100 from northern Nigeria, or do a few from here. And they're very useful academically. And to be honest, given the dearth of African data, in themselves were one of the largest, there were oftentimes the largest studies that had been done to date in that particular cancer from the region.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the data gap is millions, not even tens of thousands. And so we need to begin to solve the data gap. We need certain volume of data to be truly useful in research. So the question was, how do we begin to build enough data from Africa to begin to answer these important questions? You mentioned TCGA. TCGA, by many accounts, is probably the gold standard clinical genomic cancer database in the world.
Yeah.
It's 22,000 genomes from 11,000 cancer patients from across the United States with 31 or 32 different types of cancer.
Yeah.
And it was an NIH initiative that took over 10 years to complete, cost close to $400 million to do, but has resulted in nearly every new immunotherapy. Nearly every immunotherapy that we currently have, there's some link back to TCGA.
Yeah.
So it was, think about revolutions. It was a cancer genomic revolution, the launch and the successful completion of TCGA. Now, as fantastic as it is, it's like almost like a cliche. The issue is diversity. It's 80% white.
Yeah.
It's 9% African American. But because it's spread across so many different types of cancer, for individual cancer types, you really don't have much usable data for non-European, non-Caucasian participants.
Yeah.
Plus, African Americans themselves are an admixed population. So African Americans have different amounts of European ancestry.
Yeah.
So it's really not fit for purpose for any group or not truly fit for purpose for any group besides people of European ancestry.
Yeah.
And this is not Yemaachi saying it, it's not Yaw Bediako saying it. It's well accepted that the Achilles heel of TCGA is its lack of diversity.
Yeah.
So TACA is meant to solve that. So as I said, the data gap, globally for different diseases and different conditions is, hundreds of thousands. We need, the 3MAG is really saying, if you want to cover African diversity, you probably need to sequence at least 3 million Africans. But when you come to specific disease areas, the volumes get smaller because you're focused on a particular disease. So when you focus on cancer or a particular type of cancer, you don't need 1 million genomes to have enough data for research. You need a few thousand.
Yeah.
Right. So TCGA has probably about 9,000. I think it's 9,000 breast cancer genomes. Right. So the problem becomes more tractable when you specify.
Yeah.
So TACA is Yemaachi's response to TCGA. So TCGA very cleverly included A, T, C, and G, right? The cancer genome atlas, but it was smart because they could put T, C, G, and A, which are the four letters
the
of nucleotide. I don't know if you remember.
nucleotides. I remember, yes.
That's what they did.
Making the connection.
Now, I was trying to find a way to do TACA with that, but we couldn't find a way to squeeze in the G. So TACA, we've just used A twice.
Okay.
But, the African Cancer Atlas is meant to be a African reflection of TCGA.
Yeah.
But our unique additional sort of advantage will be ours will be drawn across the African continent. And so we'll solve that problem that TCGA has.
Yeah.
So the idea is not to replace TCGA. The idea is to complement TCGA.
Yeah.
To now say, now we have all this diversity that we can plug in. So we've designed it very mirroring what TCGA is. Now, of course, we don't have an NIH structure to fund this anywhere near the level that is required. We don't need quite it doesn't have to cost $400 million anymore, but it's still quite expensive.
Yeah.
And so the approach we took was to go to pharma.
Yeah.
So the vision for TACA is to form a consortium of pharma companies. This model is currently in use in the US. There are a number of consortia where several pharma companies have come together in a sort of non or pre-competitive manner to fund data generation.
Yeah.
So there's initiatives like Together for Change and many others in the US and in Europe where pharma collaborate together to support data generation. Together for Change is actually focused on diversity. So they're trying to focus on ethnic minority groups in the United States, recognizing that they need more genomic data. So the case is already made because pharma is trying to do it in America and in Europe. Our solution is those initiatives are good, but they will never be as good as if you did them in Africa, because even if you manage to sample nearly every ethnic minority in the US, you would not touch the level of diversity on the African continent.
Yeah.
So if diversity is a problem you're trying to solve, there's only one place that can do that for you. The problem pharma has is how do they do it in Africa? Africa is 54 sovereign countries with different levels of regulation, health systems that are different and hard to standardize. And that's where Yemaachi comes in. So our pitch to pharma is over 5 years, we have built a network currently across 9 different African countries. In
that's
every
African.
region. That's African. So North, West, East, and Southern Africa.
Okay.
We have built the infrastructure logistically to move samples around. We have built relationships with regulatory bodies, so we understand the ethics and the regulatory frameworks in these different bodies, data protection acts in different countries. So we can navigate the very heterogeneous. I mean, Africa is diverse in every way, including our regs, right? So we can navigate the regulation and make sure that everything is done according to the required standards.
Yeah.
As an African company, our identity is African, so we have the relationships that encourage people to work with us in the service of the continent.
Yeah.
But additionally, we have incredible technological and technical capacity. We can sequence as well as anybody else.
Yeah.
There will be if you take a Yemaachi sequence and a Broad sequence in Cambridge, Massachusetts, no difference, right? I would be willing to say that our sequencing will be at the quality, will be global standard. It will be pharma grade, if you want to call it that. So there's no drop off in quality by working in Africa with Yemaachi.
Okay.
And so leveraging all that we've done, the pitch is let's build TACA. Let's form a consortium and let's build this really diverse cancer database that would serve global drug discovery. So that is what TACA is. A key component of TACA is also clinical data. Yeah. So if I have your genes, but I don't have your clinical history, it's very difficult for me to make any sense of them because I need to associate your genes with your phenotype, phenotype. So Yemaachi, we have a system we have built ourselves that allows us to standardize clinical data across different clinical partners, working in both Francophone and Anglophone countries. So our platform is bilingual, and it's built to standardize the clinical data we collect to a global dictionary. Yeah. So that when we're doing research comparing breast cancer in Lagos versus breast cancer in Accra or Abidjan, the phenotypic data is standardized so that you can actually compare apples to apples. And then linked with our capacity in genomics, then we're beginning really generating world-class data sets from this hitherto unstudied group of populations. Yeah. So that is what TACA represents. In December of last year, we executed a contract with Roche as our first pharma partner, which was very exciting. And we're very grateful for Roche taking that initial step to recognize the value that Yemaachi brings, but ultimately really recognizing the value that African data brings. Yeah. And our hope over the next, we're active in business development, trying to engage with other pharma to fully round out the consortium.
Yeah.
So Roche's initial contribution is allowing us to get started.
Mm-hmm.
And their ambition is to bring in other partners, ultimately to hit 15,000 genomes in 3.5 years. So NIH took 10 years to do 22. We want to do 15,000 in 3.5. We are African, we'll do it.
Yeah.
We don't have a choice. So that is the ambition. And this will be the most genetically diverse clinical genomic database in the world.
Yeah.
Actually, I would say ever created, because it will be from the most genetically diverse population on the planet. And I think that will be the first, it will be a significant step toward diversifying precision oncology.
Yeah.
Because now the data that is so desperately needed to ensure that these drug targets are developed with everybody in mind will now be available. And a key component of that is we've secured the concession from Roche that we can make this data publicly available to African-based scientists, because this is truly African data.
Yeah.
And we believe that it should impact the continent. So as much as this is a commercial deal and there are commercial terms with our pharma partners, there is a component of this that is also building an African, you talk about sovereignty, a sovereign African asset.
Yeah.
That we think should benefit African people. So a student working in University of Ghana or University of Ibadan who wants to do a genomics project on cancer, with TACA fully finished, will not need to go and sequence more samples. They'll be able to access the data from TACA, use that in their research. And we believe this will catalyze a whole generation of research. TCGA has done that. There are startups in America that started because they could access TCGA data because of a public data set.
Yeah.
In our case, it's a private data set, but because Yemaachi is, I won't quite call us a social enterprise, but we are a very impact-focused African company. We negotiated for and secured the concession from our pharma partners that, look, let's also allow us to make this data available to African-based scientists so that it can catalyze local research.
Yeah.
So as they are researching to develop drugs, our people can also be researching, and also within Yemaachi, we'll be taking on some of that. So TACA is a culmination of 5 years of hard work, but of course, as with everything in life, it also now represents the biggest challenge Yemaachi is taking on.
Yeah.
This is a really big database. 15,000 genomes will be about 7 petabytes of data. So just from a storage perspective, like
I
petabyte.
saw that in the TCGA.
Yes.
They had 2 petabytes,
2.8
which is
petabytes. Yes.
the equivalent. 1 petabyte is like 200,000 DVDs.
Yes.
So 6 petabytes is like over 1 million DVDs worth of
And TCGA
data.
is a mixture of whole exome and whole genome. So whole exome sequencing is when our genome is really big, but there's a certain portion of it that is expressed, which is called the exome. So basically the information from about 30,000 genes. A lot of our DNA is doesn't code for genes, but is really important in regulation.
Yeah.
So for TACA, we are doing 15,000 whole genomes.
Okay.
Which is even more ambitious. But why not?
The African ambition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the point. Because it's African doesn't mean we are less ambitious. In fact, we are even more ambitious because in addition to the science being ambitious, we are working across national boundaries. This will be the first truly multinational cancer database. TCGA is all in America. UK Biobank, which is another really big genomic database, is UK.
Yeah.
So they don't have to worry about, I'm moving my sample across national boundaries. TACA does. So, but that is also what makes it so unique and so powerful.
Yeah.
And so for me, I see challenges as opportunities to show your excellence, to show why people should work with you, because you can solve the really tough problems.
Yeah.
And I think that is what African biotech is going to have to do. Because the truth is, nobody thinks Africa is ready for biotech, except the Africans who are doing it. And in order to make that case, we are going to have to take on the Everests. We're taking on the really big challenges, with hard work and with commitment, overcome those challenges and demonstrate to everybody, including ourselves perhaps, that this is possible and why we should be the heart of genomics in the next 40 years. And not just genomics. I'm an immunologist. So my interest is even going beyond genomics to immunotherapies, to immunology, understanding the immune system. All of that, I think, will stem from a realization that Africa is truly excellent at this.
Yeah.
Nobody argues with automobiles in Japan or in Germany because they built that reputation.
Yeah.
It wasn't given to them. I mean, I'm sure if you look in history, Japan was just Japanese people were heavily discriminated against and viewed as inferior, right? But nobody argues with Japanese technology. In fact, people think Yemaachi is Japanese by our name.
Yeah, the name.
Right? So nothing is given. You take it
Yeah.
through hard work. And I think that's what African biotech needs to do, is to show that we see challenges as just exciting opportunities to show what we can do. And we overcome them and we build technology. I mean, the phenotype I was talking about is an app we built.
Yeah.
Right. One of my co-founders, David, leads. We have a team of engineers. We build software because we decided there was nothing on the shelf that would do what we needed to do.
Yeah.
So we've built our own, and the whole standardization is in-house. Right. So we've seen a challenge. We've seen the diversity in African phenotypic data, and we're like, okay, we can solve it with a bit of elbow grease and a bit of technology.
Yeah.
And now it's the Yemaachi way of doing it. And that makes us valuable to our external partners.
Yeah.
So anyway, I that's my own rabbit hole. But so Taka is really Yemaachi's coming out moment.
Yeah.
It is us announcing ourselves on the global stage, securing a significant global player to support this work, and hopefully as a catalyst to secure many, many other players to really put commercial value. So Taka represents, in my opinion, I think I'm right, the most significant commercial investment in genomics ever done in Africa.
Yeah.
H3 Africa and other initiatives were bigger than Taka is for now. Taka will hopefully exceed them eventually. But they represented philanthropic or academic or, almost aid.
Yeah.
Right? Even when pharma have done this kind of work on the continent before, it's been in the form of grants and academic support.
Yeah.
Taka is not. Taka is business to business. Yemaachi is a business engaging with a pharma company to do this together. That shows pharma taking Africa seriously.
Yeah.
But they won't take us seriously unless we step up and do the work. And I think that is what the point I'm trying to make is anybody listening, we can complain about not being taken seriously, or we can do really good work and compel them through our good work to take us seriously.
Yeah.
And when that happens, I believe then money and everything else will follow to allow us to continue to build up our ecosystem.
So I think hearing all about Taka from your perspective, to me, when you compare it to kind of legacy projects like TCGA, there is an ambition to overshoot a lot of those initial legacy projects in Africa. It's very ambitious. And one of the things you mentioned was the fact that it's across multiple countries, which have completely different regulations, data laws, etc. And we tie in the concept of genomic sovereignty, but you also want the data to be available, publicly accessible to all Africa-based scientists. I think for me, when it comes to African genomic data, there's always an elephant that's sitting in the room of ownership of the data, consent. And I'm curious, how are you thinking about those issues at Yemaachi? Because you've mentioned that you guys have mastered the system and being able to navigate all of the complexity across different countries. And we're seeing the landscape is actually evolving in tandem. So significant developments in the regulatory space. So a lot of our national medicines agencies are improving, getting these global standards like WHO maturity level. Last week, or was it this week, Ethiopia just joined the list of African countries that have their national medicines agency achieving WHO maturity level 3. So yes, the landscape is also evolving in tandem, which is obviously a plus for everything Yemaachi is trying to do. But my question is, when we think about data sovereignty and ethics and even regulation, are the African government and regulators ready for this moment? If not, what needs to happen? Yeah. I'm curious to hear how you guys at Yemaachi are navigating all of this complexity.
No, it's an important question, and it's something that takes up a lot of our thinking. Our approach obviously begins with the individual. So there's all data from Yemaachi has to receive informed consent before we can collect it. So that is, hardwired into our processes.
Yeah.
Individual patients give us consent to collect their samples, to collect their data, and importantly, to use their data, which includes for whatever, if we are sharing with other parties. All of that is expelled out, explained to them, and they consent for it.
Yeah.
So at the individual level, that is sort of the baseline. Now, yes, you're right. Different countries have different levels, have different sort of regulations around data protection, what can happen with data, how it can be moved. Some are more stringent than others. Some are more restrictive than others. And I think there's a current wave of data protectionism across Africa. I don't think that's entirely a negative thing.
Yeah.
I think we need to ensure that people are not exploited. But I think there needs to be a moderated discussion about what that means, especially when we think about movement within the continent.
Yeah.
I think AFCA, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think that should include data. We should, I would like to begin to see the discussions around how data like this can be viewed similar to other things, other forms of trade or other things that are going to be hopefully made more easy across the continent. Because data is extremely valuable. Everybody, even if they don't understand data, says that data is the new oil, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
It's true. And this can be transformational for our economies, but only if we are able to use it and harness it effectively. So I'm all for safeguards. We need to be extremely stringent with how we collect this data, consenting and so on. But once those structures are in place and once the players meet certain standards, we need to ensure that we allow businesses to flourish using this data.
Yeah.
So at Yemaachi, Africa is currently at the early stages of understanding this space and figuring out how to move in this space. I think there's opportunities for us to begin to shape policy by engaging with policymakers to explain what we do, why it's important, and why there has to be movement. Science is collaborative.
Yeah.
If we just wall off Africa from the rest of the world when it comes to data, we will be the biggest losers.
Yeah.
Having said that, what are the things being put in place to protect the interests and the rights of those whose data is being shared? Once again, that is the role of African regulators, but also African industry. I think that once again, that is the importance of having Africa-based businesses in the discussion.
Yeah.
So that it's not African regulators simply engaging with multinationals, but it's African regulators engaging with African businesses and then also multinationals, because the African business is then held to account. But then also as an African business, part of their job is to protect the interests of their own constituents.
Yeah.
So I think that's a unique opportunity for African biotech to also play that bridging role, but also ensuring that the commercial benefits also come back.
Yeah.
Because regulators will regulate, but when it's a commercial deal, where does the money flow to? If you have African business involved, then there's investment coming into the continent, there's revenue coming here. So from a purely commercial perspective, that data, the commercialization of that data runs through Africa. Right? It's not extractive.
Yeah.
There's value addition happening locally. There's jobs being created locally. So I think that is the argument we need to make, to say people like me should be in the room when we are discussing how we view data.
Yeah.
So that we can speak to, as African businesses, we can speak to how we would like to be part of that process and how we will work with government to ensure that people are protected, but also the economic potential of these resources is not lost.
Yeah.
Because we should treat data like we treat oil or gold or timber or cocoa. Right now, historically, those have been very extractive.
Yeah.
We've not added value at source. Now, of course, in this country, talking about refineries, and in Ghana, we're talking about chocolate and all those things. Data is the same, and that's why Yemaachi is in the value addition business.
Yeah.
That's why we invested in our sequencing lab. I'm not interested. Taka is not samples from Africa. Taka is data from Africa.
Yeah.
And that is because that data creation is value addition. Its job creation is value addition. And we are going to continue to evolve even beyond just raw data to insights. So it's something I'm very sensitive to.
Yeah.
But I think there are people who are interested in this space, who are on the continent, who are willing to work together. Yemaachi, our data, we take compliance very seriously. We have a compliance team. We recently achieved ISO 27001 for information security. We're currently working on HIPAA and GDPR. So even though we don't need to, because we're in Africa, we're holding almost audit ready for both European and US level regs. We are compliant with the Nigerian Data Protection Act, the Ghanaian Data Protection Act, the Kenya Data Protection Act. I mean, you rack up these things because Africa is diverse.
Yeah.
That is the complexity I was talking about.
Yeah.
But that's why you need a Yemaachi, because if a big farmer was trying to do it, it would cost them a lot and they would probably not exactly know how to do it. You need that local expertise and that local navigation. I think what we do need to keep an eye on is ultimately, as businesses like us grow, being beyond the regs and the data privacy, how are local communities benefiting from our work?
Yeah.
Right. We know a lot of these drugs, that will be a lot, may be very expensive. When do we begin to try to pull our leverage to try to talk about data, drug access?
Yeah.
I think it's too early now. We're still generating foundational data. But once again, by investing in R&D, which we hope to be able to do, you are setting the foundation to begin to see how there can be differential pricing, perhaps, depending on where, and recognizing where this data came from.
Yeah.
So it's something that I keep thinking about in terms of, you're going to, I get a question, so you're going to develop new drugs, but Africans won't be able to afford it. It's like, hold on a minute. There's a process, there's a journey we are on. I know at the back of my mind, or even the front of my mind, that the local people in Africa need to also benefit from this. There are a number of companies exploring benefit sharing.
Yeah.
So there's a company in the US called Varian Bio that just signed, a really big contract with pharma. They've been around for a little while. They have a model where, as the company begins to become profitable, almost like a dividend almost will be paid to communities that enable them to actually collect their foundational data.
Yeah.
We are exploring a similar structure. We don't have it yet, but we're beginning to work through. Of course, we don't have any profits to share right now.
Yeah.
But they were beginning to work through that structure. How you can almost commoditize an individual's data for them.
Yeah.
And ensure that they benefit.
Yeah.
So once again, I think this is an opportunity for Africa to lead, because the rest of the world is beginning to ask about this. The 23andMe's of this world will not work in America again. Right? A lot of issues came up in this genomic space because people began to feel taken advantage of that.
Yeah.
You have my data and now you're signing these big deals. How do I benefit? Those ethical questions on benefit sharing have originated, not in Africa, actually originated in the US.
Yeah.
But they may not know how to solve them. I think given our culture, our focus on community, there are certain elements of our culture that I think, when intertwined with science and business, may actually provide models for really interesting community-based, but still very commercially viable biotech. So it's something, it's still very philosophical in my mind. But I think, once again, when I think of African biotech, my hope is that as we continue to develop, we'll not just get very, very good at doing good science the way the rest of the world does and being really successful businesses, but we'll also keep the African identity of, what about my people?
Yeah.
Right. And so develop and design our businesses and models that the world hasn't seen before, where biotech is actually really a really powerful force for good in the communities.
Yeah.
So I think that is where I want to take my own company, is to begin to think, how can we innovate in that space? How can we ensure that people are brought along? Because I see it as a good investment.
Yeah.
The samples we collect are from people who are very sick. We may not be able to help them. They are choosing to invest in my company by giving me that tissue sample. It's an investment in Yemaachi that they will probably not live to see.
Yeah.
Because many of these people are late stage. Because unfortunately, most people, like you said, present late. So a woman with breast cancer who knows she might die in 3 months signs a paper to say, please take my sample, because maybe to help somebody else someday.
Yeah.
That's a really emotional commitment.
Yeah.
That is probably maybe even more significant. My investors won't like to hear it, but it's more significant maybe than the money that somebody gives me. Somebody's giving me their tissue, their DNA, right? It's generosity for nothing, because they think it will help somebody else.
Yeah.
So I think we are that sort of pact that you make with somebody should inspire us to come up with innovative ways that, as we develop, we think of how we take the community along with us.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to become this unicorn, and the people who allowed you to get to a unicorn continue to be impoverished. And in a way, in biotech, in genomics businesses, it's even more stark. In fintech or other areas, they are your users. You're providing a service, and they come and they use it. And so it's a contract, right? In our space, our constituents, they are not users because they are actually investing in us.
Yeah.
So we are compelled, in my mind, ethically and morally, to think of ways how this business will also help them, not just help people in the future, not just help the world, but how will it help that small community
Yeah.
where they come from, in northern Nigeria, or in rural Ghana, or in rural Kenya.
Yeah.
How is it that Yemaachi is now listed, or Yemaachi has done so well? Have those people also done well because they worked with Yemaachi? So I don't have it figured out yet.
Yeah.
But I think it's an imperative that we do, because the more social capital we have, the more we protect the social contract
Yeah.
that we establish, the stronger our company will be. That will be a differentiator and will keep us active.
Yeah.
Because we need the goodwill of our people to support the work that we do. So I think it's actually a good business thing to do as well.
Yeah.
And I think biotech needs to take that into account. It cannot be exploitative. The moment we are like that, we will die. We will lose the hearts of the people.
Yeah.
So I think other businesses can afford to overlook it sometimes. I think biotech mustn't.
Yeah.
But I think that's also, once again, an opportunity to show the world what truly ethical, community-focused, impact-driven biotech can be, and to prove that we don't sacrifice the bottom line either.
Yeah.
That we can be billion-dollar companies, but really, really good people at the same time.
Revolutionizing the business model.
Now, some people will listen and say, "Oh, he's naive. He's what?" Maybe. Time will tell.
Yeah.
But that is something we are trying to model at Yemaachi.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think it's imperative to the success of our business to not lose the link with the people who make our work possible. It's actually one of our, sort of our mission statement.
Yeah.
Is to ensure that our work benefits the people who enable that woman with breast cancer, that man with prostate cancer, that gentleman with liver cancer. Their sacrifice, their investment in our company is what will make TACA possible. TACA is ultimately made up of 7,500 people.
Yeah.
It's not tissue or clinical records. It's human beings like you and me. And if we keep that in mind, then it directs our steps.
Yeah.
So that's the challenge on me. I think that is my personal challenge as CEO of Yemaachi, is to never wake up and forget that.
Yeah.
Always remember that these are people. They are not numbers or things in a freezer. It's human beings, it's lives. And to try to direct the company to always take that into account.
Yeah. I have so many thoughts. I think the overarching thought is thinking about the ecosystem for biotech. For this biopharma revolution we've been talking about in Africa, when you think about the ecosystem to support that, I was going to ask the cure question of what does it look like to revolutionize the biotech business model in Africa, but you've kind of touched on it in several different things that you've said. But revolutionizing the business model is almost thinking about who is in that ecosystem that is usually overlooked, that needs to be included in the ecosystem, like formally. So this idea of paying dividends in whatever form that will take as you evolve that at Yemaachi, to the patients who are investing, with the term you use, which I love, investing in, like doing a very selfless investment into Yemaachi, coming up with ways to give back to those communities, give back to those people, because they are some of your original investors, those are your seed investors. Is once you solve that, you're revolutionizing that business model of biotech in Africa. I think I'm even revealing some of my bias as somebody who has worked her whole career in the pharma landscape. I think regulation, and I think NAFDAC, and I think Ghana FDA, and I think Kenya's PPB or something. But that regulation is broad. So a lot of the regulation you actually spoke about was data protection regulation, which in some cases or most cases is somewhat separate from our national medicines agencies. So even that was like a rewiring of my brain of regulation, especially in the biotech revolution, isn't just the medicines, the data is the foundation of the biotech revolution in Africa.
Absolutely. Yeah. And especially as we enter this AI age,
Yeah.
right? AI is data driven.
Mm-hmm.
Without data, there's no AI.
Yeah.
So AI is actually going to exacerbate the demand for data.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, unless we ensure that African data is available, the disparity in outcomes will be exacerbated.
Yeah.
Because more and more things will be driven by data. If we are not in the training set, we are not in the solution. And so there's going to be a demand for data.
Yeah.
There's going to be a hunger for data. And so regulation is going to have to take that into account. So you're right. The FDAs and the AMAs, those are medicines and drugs and molecules. But there's also growing regulation required to how we handle data.
Yeah.
Whether it's financial data or genomic data, all that personal data needs to be managed. But we need to be, like I said, we need to be nuanced in the approach. We cannot be draconian and undercut the huge potential commercially that data presents.
Yeah.
At the same time, you cannot just sit back and say, okay, it's a wild, wild west, do what you will,
Yeah.
because then things will be people will be taken advantage of. So it's about striking the balance. And I think that's where the dialogue has to happen between the industries that are working on the data, the regulators, and maybe even the communities, right? To help people to understand why this data is important, why we should share data with pharma.
Yeah.
But then the question is, okay, so what are we getting in return? And then those discussions can also happen. And I think when that happens, it also empowers the African businesses like us to negotiate better with pharma. Because if I'm saying that, look, these are the regs, and this is what the government mandates, or this is what our constituents mandate, then I'm in a stronger position when I try to engage with my commercial partners to kind of secure certain concessions.
Yeah.
So if we have a unified, reasonable Africa-wide strategy for how we handle data, I think that's what's going to be needed. And I think maybe the Continental Free Trade at least provides an umbrella to begin to include that dialogue, so that there's a clear guidance that this is acceptable, this is not, and we are open for business, but business that impacts us and benefits us. So I think we have to be very careful. If different countries do it on their own, it further fragments Africa and completely undermines everything we're trying to do. We don't want more fragmentation. We want unified, reasonable, but responsible management of data. So I think that can happen. But I think maybe biotech can be one of the drivers of this, because more and more of our work will be very data driven. We are going to be the top producers and consumers of data, and so we need to be in those meeting rooms when those decisions are being made. But once again, I think it's also a way for Africa to lead the world. Let them learn from our data governance. Let the EU copy Africa's data governance structure. We don't always have to copy that. Let's innovate our own and let other people adapt from it. My dream above everything else is for Africa to change the view or the impression that Africa makes in the rest of the world. I am tired of always having people viewing Africa as this place of poverty and suffering. And yes, we have problems. Everybody has problems. But we can also be sources of great innovation and great development. And I think, my hope is that as more and more young people get into this space, whether it's biotech or other areas, we will, the Wakanda that we want is not some comic book Wakanda with cars flying. It is African excellence being portrayed on a global stage, and Africans leading and showing the world how to do stuff. People copying what happens in Africa for their own use. So that's the Wakanda we want to usher in. That's the real revolution. Outside of science and tech and health, it is a prosperous Africa leading its own destiny, and really leading the world. I don't see why not. We're the center of the earth. I mean, Africa is uniquely positioned. Everything runs through us. And yet, for some reason, for many reasons, some of which we know, and others maybe, we seem to be behind. And I'm tired of that. But no one's going to move us to the front or move us to a position of more prominence. We have to work our way there. By wanting it bad enough and working hard enough for it.
Yeah. I love that. Lots of inspirational takes in this episode. I think where I would like to conclude this kind of deep dive section of today's discussion is the funding. Let's talk about money because these are very justifiably so ambitious plans and visions for the biotech and biopharma and genomics revolutions in Africa.
Yep.
But we need to talk about who's going to pay for all of this. And in our first call that we had a few months back, you mentioned that African biotech is a no man's land, or feels like a no man's land, because global biotech VCs or investors see Africa as too risky.
Yes.
But impact investors or investors in Africa are either afraid of science or don't know the science, and so they would rather invest in other things like fintech.
Too risky.
Yes, so everybody finds it risky.
Yeah.
So you're almost in this no man's land.
Yeah.
But and interestingly, you brought this up at coffee right before this episode on one of the biggest exits on the continent was a biotech. So for all the talk of risk in biotech and nobody wants to invest in African biotech, etc., everybody wants to invest in fintech. For example, the biggest exits, and I think you mentioned it was InstaDeep, acquired by Biotech for close to $700 million, outscales some of the fintech exits that we've seen.
Yes.
And that's what happens when somebody invested in biotech in Africa.
Yes. I mean, InstaDeep is sort of a platform company, an AI-enabled drug discovery platform. So not a pharmaceutical manufacturing yet, or even a genomic company like us, but in the same value chain.
Yeah.
They developed really cool platforms to analyze genomic data, the kind of data we are producing from Taka. So they would be downstream, or actually areas Yemaachi herself wants to develop some capacity in. But yes, they started in Tunisia, homegrown, raised money, and gradually grew. And around, just after COVID, were acquired for close to $700 million by BioNTech, which are a preeminent, really large biotech company that produced one of the COVID vaccines.
Yeah.
And actually, interestingly, InstaDeep's partnership with BioNTech was around cancer. So trying to find new ways to treat cancer.
Yeah.
So it's oncology, it's African. I mean, it's basically Yemaachi. Wait, soon we'll be talking about Yemaachi one day. But it's in those lines. And that's the point, is that it's an African startup that has exited. And it's not in fintech, it's not in agriculture, it's not in the areas that investors see as less risky. It's actually in the life sciences that they say is too risky.
Yeah.
And I think actually if you take that in the context of how few, the dearth of biotech companies in Africa, if you proportionally, it actually means biotech is outperforming all of these sectors.
Yeah.
Right? But you're right. Right now, it's very difficult to raise. I mean, the markets are challenging globally anyway. Biotech and life science is always challenging anywhere because of it's viewed as a longer investment.
Yeah, so playing the long game.
You're playing the long game. It's very capital intensive. You often have to keep securing big rounds of funding to keep advancing till an exit or an IPO, or you bring something to market.
Yeah.
But the upside is also very big. So the option for a home run in biotech is a real home run.
Yeah.
So people place those bets. The challenge is getting people to recognize that those bets should be placed on the continent. Of course, investors like to point to traction.
Yeah.
They like to point to wins. And right now we don't have that many because the sector is very small. So we are one of the first. Our success will unlock opportunities for new people coming, but we have to succeed in order to get there. So I think that is one of the challenges we face, is how do we, there have been a few one high profile company that, was not successful, and that has all, but then again, there are many companies that go under in the US and nobody seems to hold it against them. It happens in Africa, all of a sudden, you can't do this in Africa. So once again, it's difficult, but it is not impossible.
Yeah.
And those of us who are in this early phase of the revolution have to recognize the burden of responsibility that rests on our shoulders. We cannot afford to mess up.
Yeah.
We have to truly hold ourselves to high standards and be excellent. But also find ways to engage with funding in different ways. So whether it is targeting philanthropy, whether it is engaging with investors in different ways, strategic partnerships with pharma.
Yeah.
I think there are certain avenues before us that we have to try to go down.
Yeah.
But it is certainly one of my personal challenges. I mean, it is what keeps me up at night is how do we engage and how do we raise the money required? Because it's very capital intensive.
Yeah.
Money that will push a fintech or another tech company a couple of years would not do the same for us just based on the type of business and the type of operations.
Because you mentioned that even within healthcare, which I found very interesting, there is a distinction between biotech and health tech.
Absolutely.
Biotech is capital intensive.
It's R&D.
It is high risk. It's R&D. It's
science.
Biotech
is R&D.
Yeah.
Health tech is usually telemedicine
It's
tech. It's tech with a health bent.
Yes.
So it's an app, it's some technological solution that will help improve access to care, improve the quality of care by its technology. Whereas biotech is life science.
Yeah.
So it is R&D. It's lab-based science, R&D done commercially, which involves considerable capex and operational costs.
Yeah.
Especially with most inputs being imported. So,
Yeah.
and so that is the distinction. So oftentimes we get lumped in. And also biotech is not diagnostic testing. Right. That is another distinction. That's another distinction. You can be a diagnostic business, not necessarily a biotech in that case. You are.
Because biotech, you're using the data you get.
At least in my definition of
processing
biotech,
it for
therapeutic
research
exactly.
reasons.
Biotech in America is usually built around developing new solutions or technologies, whether in diagnostics or in therapeutics. Whereas diagnostic test provision is more clinical testing.
Yeah.
Right. There's tech bio, which is right now I say Yemaachi fits more in tech bio actually because we are more of a database company.
Okay.
So generating data, but biotech and tech bio are both heavy R&D.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a complicated field. And a lot of money is required to really excel. And we need investors to understand that dynamic.
Because even when you think health tech, because I think a lot of the challenges that health techs face in Africa is that, yes, it's tech, which is a bit less capital intensive than biotech.
The market is Africa.
But they have to, it's capital intensive outside of the scope they would have liked because you almost have to make the system around you work for you to introduce your health tech. So a lot of, I think like MDAS, they started off diagnostics or primary care, but they had to then started building actual facilities because you have to take on the infrastructure that will enable the solution you're trying to bring. But biotech, tech bio, something like Yemaachi has that problem, but also has internally we are capital intensive. So we're capital intensive internally and capital
and then the ecosystem is also not suited. So you have to do a lot of No, I agreed. And I think it's healthcare provision versus upstream R&D development. Right. So all are important. Africa needs all of it.
Yeah.
So it's not to prioritize one over the other. It's just that you cannot take the same lens when investors are trying to evaluate investment opportunities. They cannot use the same metrics to evaluate a biotech as they would a health tech, which sometimes happens because when you have more generalist investors, they apply very similar metrics across all the interests they are evaluating. And I think that is some of the challenge that we have is, sometimes the focus is on numbers, right? So health tech is like, how many users do you have? How many facilities are using your platform? How many patient records do you have?
Yeah.
And then you come to biotech, it's not, you can't use the same metrics to judge our progress because what we are doing, the KPIs are a little different.
Yeah.
So I think it will come as the investor space matures and there's more distinction between the different types of investors. But we are here now. So we don't have time for the system to mature around us. We have to find money now. And so it involves tapping into different sectors. But it is improving. And I think the recognition of the potential value of biotech
Mm-hmm.
for Africa
Mm-hmm.
is growing. And so I think more and more people will begin to get on board.
Yeah.
So for us, it's about survival.
Mm-hmm.
It's, sticking it out, doing the hard work, doing the hard things well,
Yeah.
waiting for the rest of the world to catch up and for the windfall.
Yeah.
And I think anybody who has built any kind of business that was on the leading edge, whether it is the people who led the internet revolution, whether it's people who led personal computing, electric cars, whatever industry, if you look at their stories, they were almost ahead of their time.
Yeah.
And now we view them as revolutionary leaders of industry. So I once had on a podcast once that if conventional wisdom agrees with you, then you're not innovative enough. And so it's about striking that balance where you're not too far away, where you run out of space, but you want to be on the leading edge. And so you want most people to be like, hey, is that possible? And then the few outliers say, oh yeah, let's do this.
Yeah.
And then you drag everybody with you. So it's hard, but you want to do revolutionary things. It's hard. Revolutions are not easy. If they were easy, they wouldn't be
They would
revolutions.
happen every day. Yeah. Interesting. So I guess maybe just to round out this discussion, if you could craft an investment memo of sorts to an investor to make the pitch for African biotech investing, how would you go about it?
I think I would begin by making the case that biotech globally is ready for a new phase. Biotech globally is looking for the next fertile ground. Africa is what's left. Pharma know this. They are turning their gaze towards Africa, and they are looking. I think across the continent, we've had enough periods of political and economic stability that Africa is clearly rising. And I think the time is right now for biotech. And for the reasons we talked about before, our genetic diversity, our biodiversity, our talent pool, our demographic dividend that everybody keeps talking about, all those factors are primed for Africa to take a leadership position.
Yeah.
But the space is highly technical and capital intensive that will not happen on its own. There needs to be a catalyst. There needs to be a spark.
Yeah.
And I think the kindling is ready, right? The fire is waiting to be lit. All the pieces are in place. We just, right now, the last thing that is left is that catalytic investment.
Yeah.
To back a few strong, concerns, a few strong entities to really lead this charge.
Yeah.
And so I invite investors to join for the ride. We have companies like us and a few others have taken that first step. We are proving against all odds that Africa is ready for this. Now we need backing to scale sufficiently to really prove the case beyond reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
And so I would point to InstaDeep's exit. That even with hardly anything happening on the continent, the best exit was in this space. Like if you need any other evidence, for all the talk about fintech and all the talk about agriculture and all the attention they get, the guys who hit 700 million were guys who were looking for cancer drugs.
Yeah.
And they were investing. The person who acquired them was a big biotech company.
Yeah.
Taka, we are working with Roche. We are visible to them. If you're worried about your exit, it's probably going to be those big strategics. And that's what pharma does. Pharma acquires what they want.
Yeah.
They do it all the time. They have huge M&A departments. They have nothing in Africa and they want stuff in Africa.
Yeah.
So if we can build it properly, they will come. The investments will come. Investors will get their exits. But even beyond that, and I think my appeal would be to the impact focus, the investor who wants to see Africa rise, is to say growth of such industries will mean job opportunities for young people, will mean upskilling of young people, will mean a lot of ancillary jobs, service provision for this industry. It will be a huge catalyst. I mean, I think biotech will represent that river I talked about into this fertile ground, and all this life will emerge. So for me right now, it's because it's early, because it presents such amount of risk, the the call out to an investor is, don't you want to be part of this revolution? Like, you can look back and say, I invested there.
Yeah.
This is the equivalent of, I don't think I'm overstating. This is the equivalent of investing in Google. Like, Biotech in Africa presents African or investors who are looking at Africa opportunities to be part of the next big thing. They were there when Google started.
Yeah.
They were there when Microsoft started. This is the chance. If you miss this, you will rue it, because we will get there. Whether you help us or not, I believe this revolution is happening.
Yeah.
But investors now have a chance to say, we were part of that movement.
Yeah.
So that is the call. It's going to be based on heart, because it's a risky move. I think the numbers are there, but we are at that early stage. It's, those people who invested in Boston before Boston was Boston. That's where Africa is right now. So you need to be one of those people who wants to, has the conviction to make that move.
Yeah.
But because you want to be part of something really big, you want to look back and say, yeah, we did that. That's what we present. African Biotech is maybe the last chance, at least as far as I can see now, to be part. Fintech is already gone. Fintech in Africa is already talked about. I think biotech will be bigger than fintech globally, African biotech. But we're at that stage where you could still come in early and be part of it. So that's that. We give you a true venture. I mean, venture capital is adventure, right? So we're giving you an adventure, but it's an adventure based on real impact.
Yeah.
That will transform our continent. Novo Nordisk, I think 2024 accounted for 2% of Denmark's GDP.
Yeah.
Growth. Like, without Novo Nordisk, they'd have posted zero growth. Single company. Now, if Africa has 5 Novo Nordisks, our economies will be transformed.
Yeah.
And as an investor, you can say, I not only was part of that company doing really well, but I was part of the economic transformation of Africa. It may sound like pie in the sky, but, Jeff Bezos started selling books on Amazon. Everybody thought he was crazy.
Yeah.
Now he looks like a genius. So I think it's there. And so we need more people at the party.
Yeah.
The music has started, but it's not the Titanic. This is a party. But no, I mean, it's exciting. I think there's huge potential. So we just need people who are willing to join and bring their talents, not just their money, but their expertise and talents, to help us to grow this into the premier pharmaceutical biotech hub in the world. If Singapore, a tiny country, can become almost the center of biotech globally, how much more a continent of 1.4 billion people will make them look like small fry?
Yeah.
The potential is there. I just think we have to take it.
I think that's like mic drop. That's like the best place to conclude the discussion today. Incredibly inspiring, but also I think this conversation was a nice blend of nerd, geeking out, but also business, but also future looking. Makes me very excited about biotech in Africa and another conversation about this looming revolution. But we've covered a lot. This has been a very insightful discussion. But now I want to conclude with some rapid fire questions. So rapid fire, we're just going to ask you a question, quick 1 or 2 sentence responses. So the first rapid fire question is, what is one or who is one African scientist or innovator more people should know about?
Well, in keeping with the theme, I'm trying to find the spelling of his name. So I think it should be the co-founder, the CEO of InstaDeep. He's more of an entrepreneur, I think, and built InstaDeep as an AI company. But his name is Karim Begur. He would probably ordinarily not be the first, but if you think of an African scientist, it's not who I would think of. But to build Africa's most successful exit, I think deserves some mention. Yeah. So I think Karim would be the person. He successfully built what nobody had done before, and he took it to a 700 million exit. Yeah. Now, if I can do that, then next time somebody will say Yaw Bediako. But for now, I think it's Karim. It's, to build a truly, and he built it, I think, primarily with African-based money. Of course, North Africa, so slightly different landscape than some of us in other parts of Africa. But I think Karim in building InstaDeep to the success that it is and continues to be a success. I mean, even after the acquisition, InstaDeep is thriving within the Biotech sort of ecosystem. I think he's somebody more people should probably know about as somebody who has done it in the midst of probably huge odds.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Karim.
Okay, that's one person. If you're listening or watching, you should go do your Googling, do your LinkedIn stalking. My next rapid fire question: if you had $100 million tomorrow to invest in African biotech, what's the first thing you'd build?
I would invest it. What would I build? So build as Yemaachi. Sorry, I know it's rapid fire, but now I'm trying to divert. Of course, I'll just give it to Yemaachi.
Yeah. Okay, let's be a bit agnostic.
Okay, this is what I'll do. I have an answer for you. I would use it as proof of concept. As I've said up to now, we need to prove that this is viable from end to end, from conception to something in a clinical trial or something that can hit the market. And I think $100 million would be enough to take a few such products end to end. Probably not within just Yemaachi. We would sort of have to work with other African entities to do that. But I think I would use that money to once and for all debunk the myth that this will not happen in Africa. So take biotech end to end, idea to solution in hopefully 5 to 6 years for maybe 2 or 3. Of course, it's expensive work, but 2 or 3 products to kind of plant that as a signal to investors of why this is viable.
Yeah.
I think 100 million would do it.
Okay. I like that answer. The next rapid fire: what gives you the most hope today?
The continent. I mean, you drive around Lagos, you drive around Accra. Yes, we get annoyed with the people on the road and the drivers, but that's also what makes Africa so exciting. It is the vibrancy. Like in the midst, Africa is the example of perseverance against everything. There's no reason why our people should be as happy as we are. Slavery, they took our people. Colonization, they robbed us. We continued. COVID, they didn't care about us, and yet we're still here, right? I mean, that is that the African spirit, the African passion, the youth. I mean, 50% of our continent is average age is 19. 30% or 40% of the continent is under 15. This is where the world's future resides. That gives me hope, because that is something you cannot buy. There are countries that are begging their people to have more children. The continent of Africa does not have that issue. So I have great hope, but that hope has to manifest through providing opportunities. But for hope, it is just African people. There's nothing. Maybe I'm biased because I'm African, but my hope is just our spirit. That we smile through the adversity, and we never stop trying. And so we won't stop trying. And so there's always reason to hope.
You can't beat that African spirit. You actually just can't.
Nope.
You can't.
Yep.
Africans are unique in every possible way. My last rapid fire question: if a young African scientist or founder is listening to this, what's one piece of advice you'd leave them with?
One. Okay, I have to limit to one. Okay, can I say 2?
Yes.
It's going to be very hard. So you get ready to work harder than you've ever worked before, and you must. You have to be committed. Basketball players in the US always say, I'm committed to my craft, right? As a founder, you have to be committed to your craft, especially in Africa. There's no days off. But the second thing, and linked to that, is be your own worst critic. Don't be afraid to point out to yourself your deficiencies. Do not gloss over them. Know them before somebody else will say them to you. But don't just identify them and then just accept it. Begin to find ways, either through yourself or by who you bring in around you in your team, to make up for those deficiencies. Nobody has everything. There's no shame in identifying that I'm not very good at this. I'm good at this, but I'm not very good at that. And then with that knowledge, either practice and get better at it if you can, or bring on board people who would make up. I have done that. I still continue to try to do that with my team. But I really believe you have to know you have to be introspective and be honest with yourself in order to succeed. So be your own worst critic. It's not being down on yourself. Be confident, but be confident from a position of knowledge,
Yeah.
of being informed. That, yeah, I'm not very good at this, but I'm really good at that. I mean, I always think of the Eminem rap in 8 Mile, where the final scene, he basically says everything the guy was going to say. All the this the guy was going to say, he says. That's the best defense. Go in fully knowing this is what I'm good at, this is where I'm deficient, but this is how I'm ameliorating these deficiencies. Whether it's a pitch you're making, or you're talking to a partner, or even to your team, do not be afraid to show your human side.
Yeah.
That, yeah, I get scared. Yeah, I don't know everything. But in my humanity, I'm still trying to lead.
Yeah.
And I think that carries weight both with potential partners and investors, but especially with your team.
Yeah.
Because they have to choose to follow you. You can't force them. And I think showing a human face, not just being super boss all the time, yes sir, yes sir, yes sir, but showing that you know yourself and you know you also have deficiencies and being honest about them builds a lot of respect with your team.
Yeah. I really like that. Well, Yaw,
Yes.
thank you for sharing your journey, for showing us what's possible, for the advice. I mean, walking away from this conversation, I think for me, I start to see African biotech as a much larger picture than I did coming into this episode today, just in terms of who is in the ecosystem and how we make sure that everyone in the ecosystem is provided for, just the moonshot opportunities for African biotech in Africa. Yeah, it's been very inspiring, and I appreciate you coming and joining us on season 1 of The Cure. For all of our listeners, you can follow the work that Yemaachi is doing on LinkedIn and on their website to just see what they're making possible. And don't forget to subscribe to The Cure and share this episode with anyone who cares about the next revolution in Africa and wants to join the party before it's too late. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.